There were 4 hours left until sunset, and his basket contained only 11 measures of ore, far short of the 40-measure quota. Those who failed to meet their quota for 3 days in a row were thrown into the pit on the lower level, and no one ever returned from there. Today was the 3rd day. He stood at the face of the Black Cliff mine and looked at his hands. They were someone else's hands. Slender wrists, chipped nails, skin caked in gray dust. Just this morning, he had been a different man in a different world. For 12 years, he'd worked as a mine rescuer, pulling people from rubble. Then the rock gave way and buried him. He died under the rock and woke up under the rock. Only the rock was different. The body's memory surged up like a murky wave. The body was called number 617. The body had a name too. Kale, 18 years old, a third-class slave, the property of Baron Varga of the Rosoma tribe. 40 years ago, humanity lost the war to the beastmen and ceased to exist as a people. Humans became property. A brand burned on everyone's neck. The black pattern etched itself into the skin and bound the slave to his master's registration stone. An escape could be detected by the brand from 10 leagues away. Kale touched his neck and felt the raised lines beneath his fingers. The pattern was warm, like a fresh burn. A boy nearby coughed, about 12 years old, skinny as a pickaxe handle. His name was Finn, and his basket was even emptier. The boy was pounding the wall with all his might, and the pickaxe bounced off the rock like it was an anvil. Finn was heading for the pit at the same rate. The 3rd day, without meeting the quota. Kale looked at him, and something stirred in his chest. In his past life, he'd crawled into rubble to save strangers because he couldn't do otherwise. Death hadn't changed anything about that. He decided that the boy would meet the quota even if Kale himself were to go down into the pit in his place. It was a foolish and selfless decision, and at that moment, a light flashed before his eyes. Lines hung in the air, and no one but him could see them. The liberation system had recognized the carrier, so it was written. Kyle froze with a pickaxe in his hand. The lines drifted away. The system explained itself briefly. It exists for one purpose: the freedom of humanity. Every person whom the bearer sets free will voluntarily give him a copy of their greatest talent. The person themselves will not lose that talent. The bearer will receive a second one, identical to the first. Next came the conditions. Freedom is a shattered brand and a person's own decision to be free. One without the other does not count. Kale swallowed hard. At the bottom of the lines, the final entry smoldered. The first liberation must take place within 10 days. Otherwise, the system would fall asleep forever. The countdown had begun. The world around him had changed. Kale could now see the brands through clothing and rock. Dozens of black knots glowed in the darkness of the tunnels like coals. A thin thread trembled above each one and stretched upward toward the overseer's tally stone. And he could also see willpower. In some, it smoldered, barely alive. In Finn, it burned with a stubborn, angry flame. Kyle smiled for the first time in 2 lifetimes. Then he looked at the face of the mine with the eyes of a mine rescuer. 12 years underground teach you to listen to the rock. He tapped the wall with the butt of his pickaxe and walked along the tunnel, listening to the echo. Near the old support, the sound dropped into emptiness. There was a cavity behind the wall, and where there's a cavity, there's loose rock. And where there's loose rock, there's friable ore that doesn't need to be cut out. It just needs to be shoveled out. The old man in the neighboring working raised his head. The old man's name was Adon, and he'd been cutting this rock for 30 years. He said that behind this support was barren rock, and that he himself had checked this spot back when the previous foreman was in charge. Kale didn't argue. He knocked out 2 rotten posts, repositioned them based on memories from a past life, and brought down the thin wall inward. Beyond the wall lay a scree field. Moon iron glinted dimly in the debris, an entire vein ground down by a long-ago rock slide. Odan stepped closer, and his expression began to change. For 30 years, he'd believed he knew this mine. Now he stood there in silence. Kale called over Finn, and they began shoveling ore with their bare hands. The boy's basket was full within an hour. Then Kale's basket was full. Then another. Odan stood nearby the whole time. Then the old man silently took his basket and held it out beneath the scree. Kyle nodded. By sunset, the 3 of them had hauled 120 meters of ore to the surface. The weigher at the hoist counted the tags twice. Overseer Hargosh came in person. The werewolf was 2 heads taller than a man. Gray fur, yellow eyes, a leather apron with hooks for the ropes. He took tag number 617 and stared at the numbers for a long time. Yesterday, this slave had brought in 9 meters. Today, 60. Kargash leaned in and drew in a breath near Keel's face. Keel stared at the floor as a slave was supposed to and counted his heartbeats. The werewolf said that the weak don't become strong overnight.
He said that the slave had either found a rich vein and kept it to himself or had been stealing ore from other people's baskets. Both were punishable by death. Keel replied in an even voice that the old support had given way, exposing the scree, and that he'd simply shoveled faster than the others. Kargash thought for a moment. Then he smirked and made his own decision.
He announced that since number 617 was so lucky, starting tomorrow his quota would be 60 meters. And his workfront's quota would be doubled. The old men behind him groaned muffled groans. Hargash walked away satisfied. He had hung a stone around Kale's neck that was meant to drown him. That night, the barrack smelled of rotten straw and wet stone. Finn brought Keel half of his bread ration and set it down in silence. Keel broke off a piece and gave most of it back. The boy ate and looked at him as if he were some kind of miracle. Odan sat across from him, wide awake. The old man asked quietly how Keel had found out about the void beyond the fortress. Keel said he'd listened to the stone. Odan shook his head and said he'd been listening to that stone for 30 years, and the stone had never told him anything like that. But there was no longer any mockery in the old man's voice. There was something else in it. Kale lay on the bunk and stared at the lines before his eyes. 9 days until his term was up. He sifted through his body's memories and pieced together a picture of the mine. 4 levels, 300 slaves. A pit on the lowest level where the mountain serpent lived, fed by the beasts with those who had transgressed. The forge by the second hoist. And the punishment cell near the forge. A man had been dying in the punishment cell for 3 days. During the day, Kale had overheard a conversation among the weighers. The blacksmith Bran was in the punishment cell, the mine's finest hammer wielder. A week ago, he ruined an entire batch of blades for the garrison. He ruined them on purpose. He tempered them so that the steel would shatter at the first blow. The beasts had crushed his right hand in a vice, and in 3 days, they were going to throw him into the pit in front of everyone. As a lesson to the rest. Kyle closed his eyes. The system glowed faintly in the darkness. He found their first one. The morning began with the whip. Hargash marched down the line and reminded everyone of the new regulations. Kyle's work face hummed with muffled rage, and that rage was directed not at the werewolf, but at Kyle himself. The men decided that the upstart had drowned them all. Kyle made no excuses. He led Finn and Odan to the scree and showed the others how to set up supports so they could dig out of the cavity without dying. By noon, the tunnel was ahead of schedule, and the anger began to subside. Meanwhile, the system showed him a new line, sparks of will. Every honest step taken for the sake of another person gave the bearer a spark. The sparks were the fuel needed to destroy the brand. 30 sparks were needed for one brand. He had 4. Kyle began collecting them. He did this for 2 days, taking care that no one saw through his plan. He reinforced the rotten support in the old women's tunnel, and the tunnel stopped crumbling. He gave his water to a tunnel digger who was reeling from thirst. He set the loader's shoulders straight, drawing on memories from a past life, and taught Finn how to carry baskets down the slope without straining his back. He showed Odan how to read the cracks overhead. On the evening of the 2nd day, the spark counter read 33. And later that same evening, Odan sat down beside him and said he'd been watching him since yesterday morning. The old man said that Kale was doing all this for a reason, and that he'd never seen anyone like him in his 30 years underground. Then the old man asked what Kale had in mind. Kyle looked him in the eye and said nothing. And Odan nodded and said that silence was the right answer, and that if he needed a pair of old hands, Kyle had them. On the night of the 3rd day, Kyle went to the punishment cell. He walked through the ventilation shaft he'd spotted earlier that day. The shaft led to the back wall of the smithy. The cell's bars were designed for beasts, and a man slimmer than average could squeeze through sideways. Kale slipped through. Bran was awake. The blacksmith sat against the wall, holding a shattered arm wrapped in black rags on his lap. A burly man, as big as a door. His beard was caked in dried blood. His eyes were calm, like those of a man who had already made up his mind. He asked quietly who Kale was. Kale told the truth, as much as he could. He was a slave from the upper horizon, and he had come to offer Bran his freedom. The blacksmith laughed silently, and that laughter was more terrifying than a scream. He replied that freedom inside the mine was simply death with a fancy name, and that he would get it anyway in 2 days in the pit. Kale sat down across from him and began to speak. He said that Brana's death was already recorded in the ledger stone and that they could use that to their advantage. No one searches for someone who is officially dead. He laid out the plan. In the old edit of the Fourth Horizon, the rock is hanging by a thread. Kale would cause it to collapse so that everyone would see it as an accident. That night, a tunnel digger with no relatives had died in the barracks, and his body hadn't yet been handed over to the weighers. The body would lie beneath the rubble, dressed in Bran's rags. As for Bran himself, he'll slip through the ventilation shaft into an abandoned tunnel beyond the third hoist, a place that's dry and where animals don't venture because there's nothing to take there. Bran listened in silence. Then he said the plan was as full of holes as a sieve and that the brand would give him away alive, no matter where he hid. Kyle replied that the brand would cease to exist. The blacksmith looked at him as if he were mad. Then Kyle raised his hand and touched the black pattern on the blacksmith's neck. He stated the final condition aloud. Bran must want to be free of his own accord, not a survivor, not a fugitive, free. The blacksmith was silent for a long time. Then he spoke in a hoarse voice. He had forged weapons used to kill people, and one day, he couldn't bear it anymore and ruined the steel. He thought that had set everything right. Now he realized he had simply chosen a beautiful death over an ugly life. But what he really wanted was just one thing: to live to see the day when the hammer in his hand would forge for people, not for beasts. He said he wanted to be free. All 30 sparks vanished at once. The brand beneath Keel's fingers flared up and began to crumble. Pain struck them both. Keel kept his palm on the stranger's neck and felt the black lines burn away from within. Bran didn't scream. He wept silently and soundlessly, the way very strong people weep. The pattern crumbled into gray ash. The thread connecting him to the accounting stone snapped, and then the gift came. A stranger's knowledge surged into Kale's chest and fell into place like a key in a lock. A blacksmith's intuition. The world came alive with sound. Every piece of metal in the forge behind the wall sang in its own voice. Keel heard the weariness of the old pickaxes, the hidden crack in the door hinge, and the pure note of fine steel in the overseer's blade hanging on the rack. He now knew how metal flows under the hammer. He knew it not with his head, but with his hands. Bran looked at him and said he'd felt something leave him in return, and that now there were 2 of them like that in the world. By dawn, everything was done. The old Adit lay exactly as Kale had calculated. The rumbling roused the entire second horizon. Sticking out from under the boulders were the blacksmith's rags, and whatever the beast had mistaken for the blacksmith, no one bothered to clear the rubble for the sake of a dead slave. By then, the accounting stone had already signaled death, and the record matched the scene. Kargash stood over the rubble, sniffed the air, and left. Meanwhile, Bran was sitting in a dry tunnel behind the third hoist, drinking water from Keel's flask and sorting through the scraps of iron with his good hand, scraps that Keel had hauled over for him during the night. The blacksmith said that even with just one hand, he'd make what they'd soon need out of this junk. Keel asked how he knew they'd need anything. Bran chuckled into his beard and replied that a man who extinguishes brand marks won't stop at just one blacksmith. For 2 days, everything was quiet. On the third day, the silence ended. Hargash surveyed the horizon and announced that over the past month, 7 more slaves had died in the mine than had been handed over to the Waymasters. He said the Baron's accounts didn't add up, and when the accounts don't add up, it means someone is stealing from the master. Then he stepped aside, and a new beast stepped forward. A hyena man with a spotted hide, a flat snout, and white eyes. Kargash named him Skarl, the Baron's hound. Skarl's nose picked up a week-old scent through the stone. The hyena man walked slowly along the ranks and lingered near Keel for one extra breath. Its white eyes looked right through him. Then the hound moved on toward the bars of the lower tiers. At the bars, it stopped, drew in a deep breath, and stood there for a very long time. Keel realized a simple truth. Skarl's sense of smell cannot be fooled by purity. It can only be fooled by a stench stronger than that of a human. The blacksmith's keen sense detected a sour note of sulfur veins in the rock of the fourth horizon. Kyle went down there with a basket, pretending to be gathering ore. He He gathered some yellow stones and, over the course of the night, scattered sulfur dust throughout all the passages around Bran's attic. In the morning, Skarl ventured down and came back up, sneezing and shaking his head. The hyena man told Hargosh that the lower levels were breathing sulfur and that no one could stay there. The first move had been made, but the mine was already burning with another calamity. A lung disease was spreading through the barracks. People were coughing up blood and wasting away within a week. In a month, the disease had claimed 11 lives, and now Finn was coughing. The boy hid his cough in his sleeve and looked at Keela with guilty eyes as if being sick were a crime. A female doctor worked in the mine infirmary, a slave named Mayora. People spoke of her quietly and warmly. Before the war, her family had been healing people for 6 generations in a row. The beasts kept her around for the sake of the valuable first-class slaves, but they forbade her from using medicine to treat coal dust under threat of the whip. She used it anyway. She stole from her own infirmary and, at night, brought the decoction to those who still had a chance of pulling through. 3 days ago, the weighmaster caught her by the barracks with a flask and reported her. She was sentenced to 20 lashes and spared only because there was no one to replace her. Kale came to the infirmary with a finger bloodied to a pulp, as if it were his pass. Mira bandaged his hand quickly and precisely, and he watched her will with his systemic vision. Her will burned with a steady white fire unlike any he'd ever seen. He said quietly that the rot was coming from the water in the lower tank and that the tank needed to be boiled out. She looked up. She asked how a miner knew about the water. He replied that he'd seen something like this before in another place. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that she'd mentioned the tank to the overseers a month ago and that the beasts wouldn't heat water for the livestock. She pronounced the word livestock evenly, and that evenness was colder than a scream. Kale left the infirmary with a decision made. The system showed 26 sparks. He gathered the rest in 2 days. He boiled down the lower tank himself at night over the coals of a portable brazier. He carried a bundle of yellow stone out of the sulfur tunnels and taught the old women how to fumigate the barracks. He made Finn a decoction based on a recipe he'd overheard from Mira, and the boy began to breathe more easily. Odan watched all this, and one night said that if Kale had the same plans for the healer as he did for the blacksmith, then he should consider the old man his right-hand man. Kale asked what Odan knew about the blacksmith. The old man shrugged and replied that the body under that rubble was a palm's width shorter than it should be, and that 30 years underground teach you to measure with your eyes. Then he added that no one else had noticed this, and no one ever would. The plan for Mira was cobbled together from sheer rot. A woman who died of illness wouldn't be taken to the weighers to be measured and examined. They feared contagious beasts to the point of trembling and ordered the bodies to be burned immediately behind the dump. Kale came to Myra at night through the infirmary window and laid everything out as it was. The brand, the system, Bran down below, freedom in exchange for a single decision of her own. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked just one thing. Would she be able to treat her own people down there? Or did freedom mean sitting in a hole? Kale replied that freedom meant her hands would belong to her, and to those she herself chose. Mara rolled up her sleeve, showed him the old scars from the whips, and said she'd made her choice 20 years ago. She said she wanted to be free. The brand burned away beneath Kale's palm, and a healing vision settled in his chest. The world became deeper once more. He could now see through skin. He saw murky patches of rot in the lungs of sleeping people. He saw Odan's old fracture, which had healed crookedly. He saw the points of life where the body holds together and the points where it breaks. The knowledge was double-edged, and Kale immediately understood its other side. Whoever sees where the body holds together also sees where to strike. Mira's death was staged 2 nights later. A lonely woman her age died of rot in the barracks. Odan and Kale worked together to swap her body in the cremation sack behind the dump heap by the light of the embers. Mira went down through the ventilation shaft with a bag of herbs she'd stolen from herself. Bran met her in the tunnel, silently moved her to the best spot by the fire, and placed a forged hook, which he'd made with one hand, under the bag. The first thing Mara did was examine his shattered wrist and say that the bones had healed haphazardly, and that she would break them again and set them properly. The blacksmith turned pale and agreed, and up above, the trap began to close. Skarl found no trail, but did discover a pattern. He reported to Hargosh that the deaths in the mine were strange. Those who died had no relatives, and they died comfortably. The werewolf listened, his yellow eyes darkening. At the morning roll call, Hargosh stepped before the ranks without his whip, which made him all the more terrifying. He said that a thief had taken root in the mine, stealing the Baron's most valuable possession, the ledgers. He gave them 5 days. If, in 5 days, the culprit wasn't lying at his feet, then every 10th slave would be sent to the pit by lot. He said the snakes down below hadn't had their fill in a long time. The ranks were silent, as 300 people can be when they stand in silence. Kale stood in that silence and counted. Releasing them one by one was no longer an option. Every brand that was erased now meant the lives of others, chosen by lot. There was only one path left, and that path was madness. Everyone who wanted to leave must leave, the entire mine, all at once. In 5 days, there was a way out. Kale remembered it from his body's memory and verified it with a blacksmith's intuition and the ears of a mine rescuer. The old drainage tunnel on the second level ran north and once emerged onto the slope beyond the ridge. 30 years ago, it had been flooded and abandoned, but it was a dry summer and the water should have receded below the old water table. That night, Kale crawled through the tunnel for 1,500 paces, chest deep in black water, and at the end of the second 1,000, he saw a gray spot ahead. The night sky, the grate at the exit, was eaten away by rust. The path was there. What remained was the impossible: to get the people through it before 5 days were up and ensure that the pursuers didn't follow in their wake. He started with the people. Odan led 9 men, whom he trusted as much as himself, into the far end of the tunnel that night. Kyle spoke to them without the system and without miracles. He said he knew the way out, and that those who left would face death with a 50-50 chance, while those who stayed would face a 1 in 10 chance. He said that everyone had to choose for themselves, and that no one would blame those who chose to stay. By the morning of the 3rd day, there were 34 volunteers, the old men, Finn and the boys, 2 tunnelers with their wives from the laundress's barracks. Preparations began with the 3 free men working together. Bran, with his reassembled brush, hammered away all night long, and from the junk emerged crowbars, wedges, and 8 short tips for pickaxe handles. Mira brewed a fortifying potion and nursed back to health those who could only have reached the tunnel by crawling. Kale did the most important work. The system, after 3 liberations, had unlocked a new ability for him called Cover. The bearer could suppress another's brand for a single day. The brand remained on the skin, but the thread connecting it to the tracking stone would cease to pulse, and the stone would show the slave in a peaceful sleep. 34 brands required nearly all of his accumulated sparks. Kale gathered what he needed over 2 days of helping others and losing sleep, and by the deadline, the counter showed he had enough. All that remained was the chase. By the sound of the rock, Kale identified the main northern tunnel, the only way for a large group to reach the drainage channel. The rock there hung precariously, waiting for a single, well-placed blow. He calculated this blow just as he had once calculated targeted collapses in his past life. On the night of the 5th day, it all began. The men left the barracks in pairs through the ventilation shafts, and Odan led them down to the mouth of the adit. Kale brought up the rear, sealing off the blasting charges one by one with a layer of rock. Black patterns crumbled beneath his palm. By midnight, all 34 of them were standing knee-deep in water in the black tunnel shaft, breathing as one in shared fear. Kale struck the calculated support, and the northern adit collapsed behind them, 100 paces of solid rock. The rumble reached the surface and roused the garrison, and at the tunnel's exit, white eyes were waiting for them. Skarl hadn't picked up a trail. Skarl had picked up a thought. The hyena man had spent 3 nights poring over maps of old workings and calculated the only way out of the mine just as Kale himself would have. He stood alone by the rusty grate because glory isn't shared, and in his paw he held a hook on a chain. The tunnel digger was the first to crawl out of the opening, and the chain snapped his shoulder in a single swing. People screamed in the shaft, and the scream carried across the water. Kale went out to face the hunter alone. He had a pickaxe with a forged Branna tip and 2 eyes. Skarl was faster than any man, and the first chain passed so close it sliced the skin on his cheekbone. But his healing vision saw right through the hyena man's body. It saw the points where the beast was holding on, an old tear beneath his left shoulder blade, a knee still fragile from a long-ago fracture. Kyle stopped dodging the beast and began to dismantle it as if it were rubble. A pickaxe blow to the knee, a dodge under the chain, the butt of the pickaxe to the spot beneath the shoulder blade. Skarl howled and collapsed onto his side, and Kyle finished him off quickly and without malice, as one finishes what must be done. Its white eyes went dark. Behind them in the mine, Hargosh howled by a fresh pile of rubble, his howl mingling with the tolling of the alarm bell. It would take the garrison a week to clear 100 paces of rock. 34 men stepped out into the night sky, and many of them saw the stars for the first time in 10 years. Finn stood with his head thrown back, silent. Keel wouldn't let them linger. Before dawn, they had traveled 8 leagues north along stream beds where the scent wouldn't linger. Keel led them, reading the terrain like a book. On the 3rd day of their journey, his mountain rescuers' eyes found what they were looking for, a karst valley enclosed by cliffs, with a single entrance through a gully. Inside, a warm spring gushed forth. The grass came up to their waists, and there were the gray walls of an old human outpost that had fallen during the war. The roofs had burned down 40 years ago, but the masonry still stood solid. Here, Kale halted the column and spoke 3 words. "This is our home." For the first week, the valley was a hive of activity. Braun set up his forge in the old guardhouse and reforged the hunters' captured iron. Miura cleared a vegetable garden from wild herbs by a warm spring and set up an infirmary out of 2 straw mats. Odan sent the young ones up to the walls to learn to read the wear and tear of the stone in the old masonry. Kale was extinguishing the brand marks, now for real, one by one each day, as long as the sparks lasted. Every evening by the fire, one person would speak aloud that they wanted to be free, and the black pattern would crumble into ash amid the general silence. The gifts given to Keel were simple and honest. Odan passed on the intuition of weary rock, and now Kale could sense future rockfalls a day in advance. The trailblazer passed on the memory of the roads. The washerwoman passed on animal-like hearing. Kale freed Finna as the 7th, and the boy passed on the gift of an infallible memory. Everything he had ever seen remained with Kale forever. The valley began to breathe like a living place, and like any living place, it began to smell of smoke. On the 9th day, a sentry ran down from the wall, white as chalk. Beyond the ridge, on the old road, riders on horned lizards stood watching a wisp of smoke rise above the valley. Baron Varga's hunters were searching for 3 dozen missing slaves, and the bounty for them was rising with each passing day. By evening, the riders had left, but Odan said by the campfire what everyone was thinking. If they'd left, it meant they'd return with a count. And the next morning, a second misfortune came to light. A man had disappeared from the valley. A quiet, sullen tunnel digger named Hess had taken a knife and a flask and left during the night through the gully. His sleeping berth was cold. The tracks led south, toward the road, toward the hunters. Kyle set out on Hess's trail before dawn, taking with him only a pickaxe and a washerwoman's keen sense of hearing. The trail led south for 8 leagues and ended at the highway, crushed by the ruts and the claws of the lizards. Beyond that point, the trail was not Hess's. Beyond that point, it was the hunter's trail. Kyle lay in wait among the rocks by the highway, and by noon, he saw everything for himself. A convoy was traveling along the road, 12 riders on horned lizards, a covered wagon, and a cage on wheels made of black iron. Walking alongside the rear side of the cage was a man with a rope around his neck and a battered face, Hess, a living bait, whom the hunters were hauling along the ridge, waiting for his own people to come and rescue him. But Kale was no longer looking at Hess. Inside the black iron cage sat a gray-haired man with his back straight. Even in chains, he sat as one would at a council of war. Kale activated his infallible memory, and it dredged up from the depths a stranger story he'd heard in the barracks. The last human general had been captured alive in the mountains that spring, Tarion, the one who had held the southern pass for 11 years after everyone else had fallen. The Empire was transporting him to the capital for execution on the Feast of Conquest, and the convoy was heading straight for the pass. Kale lay among the rocks and did the math. 12 hunters meant certain death for his 30 men. But the convoy would pass through Wolf's Tooth Gorge, where the road is squeezed between the cliffs, and in his valley lives an old man who can hear the weariness of stone, and a blacksmith who can reforge anything into anything overnight. He returned to the valley at sunset and laid everything out around the communal fire. He said honestly that they didn't have to go, and the hunters would leave with Hess and the general over the pass, and the valley would remain quiet for another month. And he said that if they wanted to be people rather than vermin, there was really no choice. Odan was the first to stand up, then Bran, then everyone else. The night was spent preparing. Bran forged 6 wide chisels for stone wedges and a chain hook modeled after Scarla's weapon. Odan and Kyle went into the gorge after dark and listened to the rock together. The rock above the road had weakened in 3 places and had been threatening to fall for about 10 years. They stabilized it with wedges and careful calculations. Mara divided a sleep-inducing potion and a burning ointment among the flasks and said she would take alive anyone brought to her, while still warm. They set up the ambush just as Kale had learned to clear debris in his past life. Think first, then strike. The column entered the gorge around noon. The lead lizards passed the white mark on the rock, and Odan knocked out the keystone. The rock fell in front of the column, cutting off their path. A second avalanche of rocks fell behind them. The 12 riders found themselves trapped in a stone bag with 2 dead lizards beneath the first avalanche. Chaos was bound to ensue, and chaos did ensue, but not the kind they expected. The commander of the Lynx People Hunters, clad in scaly armor, didn't lose his composure for even a moment. He organized the 8 survivors into 2 lines, urged them on, and led them across the rocks in short bursts so skillfully that the first rock throws missed their mark. Kale realized that he was facing not an overseer, but a soldier. And then a gray-haired man rose from the cage. Tyrion watched the battle through the bars for 3 heartbeats and spoke loudly and concisely. He shouted to the men on the rocks that those on the left should strike not at the shields, but at the legs on the count of 3, while those on the right should hold their throws until he gave the word. His voice was such that everyone obeyed, including Kale. Chaos gave way to order. A volley aimed at the legs took down a line of lynxes during the first charge, and the held-back volley struck down the second line right in the open. The commander of the hunters broke through the stones alone, reached the cage, and raised his blade over Tyrion so that the Empire would not be left without an execution. Kyle got there first. Bran's chain hook grabbed the lynx by the ankle, and his healing vision finished the rest. The battle took a heavy toll. One of the fugitives, a pathfinder, died instantly from the lynx's blade. The second died in Mara's arms by evening. Gessa was found alive near the wagon, though his fingers were broken. He wept and begged not to be cast out, and no one cast him out. Kyle's blacksmith's intuition had been reading the black iron cage for an hour. The lock was an imperial design with a secret mechanism, but the metal itself revealed where it had worn out. Tarion stepped out of the cage, cracked his knuckles, and looked his rescuers over with a long, lingering gaze. Then he said what was on his mind. He said he saw 36 emaciated slaves and 1 young boy leading them, and that this band wouldn't survive until the first real detachment arrived. He thanked them for saving him and added that there was no need to make him a symbol of the rebellion because he had already lost his war. Keel didn't argue. He simply led the general into the valley. For 3 days, Tarion walked silently through the outpost. He watched as Odan taught the young men to listen to the wall, as Bronn marked the reforged blades with a brand in the shape of an open ring, as Mira kept track of the herbs on a small wooden board, how the patrols rotated according to a schedule that Kale had drawn up based on the eyes and ears others had given him. On the 3rd evening, the general stopped at that schedule, and his face began to change, just as Odan's face had once changed in the mineshaft. He came over to the campfire, sat down across from Kale, and said he had been wrong. He said that in 11 years at the pass, he hadn't managed to build what this boy had built in a month. People who aren't afraid. Then Kale told him everything, the system, the brands, the gifts, and he asked if Tarion wanted to be free. The general was silent for a long time. Then he replied that the black iron had been removed from him, but there was no one to remove the war he carried within, and that if freedom meant the right to start that war anew and in a different way, then yes, he wanted to be free. The brand of the Black Imperial script burned the longest of all, searing them both to the bone, and then the eye of war settled within Kale. The world grew deeper once more. Kyle looked down from the wall at the valley and saw it as a living map. Lines of approach, dead zones, points where the defense held and points where it broke. He could now see the battle before the battle even began. That night, they sorted through the papers from the covered wagon, and the joy of victory came to an end. The convoy did not belong to Baron Varg, but to the imperial court. The capital would notice the general's disappearance in 2 weeks, when the convoy failed to appear at the pass. There was a second sheet among the papers, a provincial circular seeking an unknown troublemaker who was removing brand marks. The reward for his capture was so high that the figure had to be read 3 times. Kylie burned the sheet in the fire, but the word it contained had already taken on a life of its own. In a month, a merchant from among the fugitives would bring news that on the walls of 3 cities, slaves were scratching an open ring with charcoal and whispering the name, the brand remover. Tarian listened to all this by the fire and spoke as calmly as if discussing the weather. He said that they now had at most a year before the Legion arrived here, and that hiding for the entire year would simply mean choosing the spot for their own graves. He unfolded a captured map of the province on a rock and placed his finger on a point in the valley of the Great River, the city of Graven. 20,000 branded, the Empire's ore depots, and a garrison of 400. The general said there was only one way to survive, to grow faster than the pursuit. Kale looked at the map and the system silently opened a new line before his eyes. The next task? To free 100 people. It was impossible to raise 100 people in the valley. They could only be taken from the Empire. Tarion spread the map out on a rock and traced his finger along the river. Between the valley and the city of Graven lay 3 small estates. Baron Varga's sawmill on the 8th league, a river wharf with a salt works on the 15th, and a quarry belonging to a certain Mr. Krog at the 20th league. The general had said that you don't start a war by storming a fortress. You start a war by teaching people to march in formation and win with minimal bloodshed. They chose the sawmill as their first target. Kyle knew it from stories told in the barracks. 40 slaves, 6 guards, young werewolves, whom Varg had exiled there for misconduct. The operation was considered a punishment for both the slaves and the guards. Kyle conducted the reconnaissance himself over 2 nights. The Eye of War scanned the terrain and analyzed it like a blueprint. The palisade was rotten on the north side. The dogs were tied up on the windward side. Guard shifts occurred at irregular intervals because the young beasts were lazy. He lay in the ferns and saw the weak spots in the sawmill's defenses. There were 4 such spots. Inside the palisade lived another force, as reported by the laundress. At night, a low female voice spoke near the barracks, and it spoke in such a way that the others fell silent. The voice belonged to a tall woman named Zelda, who had captained river barges before her branding, and whom the beasts had tried to break 3 times, and failed every single time. The sawmill slaves obeyed her more than they did the guards. Tarion spent 3 days devising a plan and herded everyone around like soldiers. He took 18 men and divided them into 3 groups of 5, plus a reserve. Bran forged a short blade for each man and taught them to strike from below, under the armor. Mira brewed a sleep potion in a barrel of water. Odan and Kyle kept watch over the palisade and the ground beneath it at night. Finn begged to join the mission, but Kale forbade it, and the boy took silent offense, acting like an adult. They took the sawmill without a single casualty. The night before the supply convoy was due to change shifts, Kale crept over to the guard's well and poured Mira's potion into their barrel. By midnight, 4 of the 6 beasts were sleeping with their muzzles on the tables. The 2 who were awake were taken by Tarion's 5s during an uneven guard rotation at 2 of the 4 points designated by the Eye of War. The dogs didn't even bark because Kale had calculated the wind direction and his approach along the windward side over the course of a day. The slaves were roused quietly, and that's when the plan fell apart for the first time. Zelda stepped forward and blocked the barracks with her body. She said she knew nights like this. Brave men come. Take away a dozen strong ones, and the next morning, the beasts slaughter the remaining old men for their negligence. She said she wouldn't sacrifice her people for someone else's bravery. Kyle didn't argue and didn't try to work any miracles. He said he would take everyone, every last one of them, including those who were bedridden, and that for the beasts, this night would look different. Then he explained exactly how they would burn down the sawmill along with the sleeping guards and the dogs' corpses, and the beasts would read in the ashes a rebellion and a collective death by fire. The record stones would confirm it, because Kale would cover all 40 brands at once, and by dawn, extinguish them forever. Zelda listened with a stony expression. Then she asked why she should believe a slave from a foreign mine. Kyle silently unbuttoned his collar and showed her his neck. There was no brand on his neck, only a pale mark, like an old burn. Zelda stared at that mark for a very long time. Then she turned toward the barracks and gave her brief command. Rise. They set out before dawn, and the glow of the sawmill stood behind them like a red wall. 40 people walked through the forest, and Zelda brought up the rear, urging on those who lagged behind like a barge against the current. In the valley, she met Mara with a cauldron and a makeshift infirmary. By noon, the outpost was buzzing like a beehive, and amid that buzz, Keel sensed a new problem: food. 78 mouths to feed required 3 times more food than the valley could produce. Supplies would last only 20 days. What followed was a month that Keel later could not recall in its entirety, but only in fragments. Fragment 1: a wharf with a saltworks, taken using the same method, but this time by Zelda herself, who knew the river guards by name and knew which of them was corrupt. They bribed the corrupt guard with salt from his own warehouse. 26 men and 6 boats set off upriver in a single night, and the wharf burned to the water's edge. Snippet 2. Krog's Quarry, where the plan fell apart completely because the owner turned out not to be a lazy baron, but a former officer who kept guards posted as if in a military camp. Tarion scrapped the stealthy approach and went for a high-profile one. A false fire in a distant warehouse drew away half the guards, and the 5 of them marched in formation through the open gates. There, Kale killed his second beast and, in the same place, lost a man from the first mining squad, the tunnel digger who had once been the first to follow him into the water of the tunnel. Cut 3. Nighttime campfires at the outpost, around which every evening one person would say they wanted to be free. The brands crumbled to ash one by one, and the system's counter crept upward. 60, 75, 90. The gifts came pouring in, and Kale stored them within himself like tools in a belt. Zeld's river instinct, the night vision of an old poacher, the steady hand of a stonecutter, the herbal knowledge of an old medicine woman, the voice of the wharf master that everyone heeded. By the end of the month, the valley had outgrown the valley itself. 111 people, 3 blacksmiths' forges, a vegetable garden by a warm spring, and the first plowed field on the terrace. The outpost wall, raised an elbow's height by the hands of Krog's stonecutters. Tarion held a review and lined up 70 men capable of bearing arms in 2 ranks, and the ranks stood perfectly straight. The general marched along the line, and Kale saw his face. It was the face of a skeptic who had once said that the band would last only until the first detachment arrived. Now that face was looking at the first detachment. Tarion said quietly that he was taking back his words for the second time in his life, and that very night, the system showed the completed task and a new line: 100 freed. The next milestone, 1,000. And in the morning, Finn ran in from the southern sentry post. Kyle himself had posted him on the wall to keep him busy. The boy reported briefly, like an adult. On the road beyond the ridge, dust was rising from a column. Not hunters, soldiers. Kale climbed onto the wall with the eye of war and looked. An Imperial half-Satnya with a supply train was heading toward the burned-down sawmill, and riding with them was a beast in a black cloak without insignia. Stidor, the Eye of War, assessed their formation in a minute. The half-Satnya marched competently, with sentries and scouts on the flanks. The figure in the black cloak rode in the center, and the threads of the formation radiated out from him like a knot. The Empire had stopped sending hunters. The Empire had sent someone who knew how to think. By evening, the patrols reported that the column had set up camp on the ashes of the sawmill, and that the man in the black cloak had spent 2 hours walking among the embers, gathering something from the ground. Tarion listened and gave it a brief military-style name: the Investigator. He said that people like that don't chase trails through the forest. People like that stay put and wait for the trail to come to them. And, looking at Keel, he added that from now on, every new sortie would be a confrontation with a very clever enemy. The Investigator's name was Vaish, and the valley learned that name the hard way. For the first week, the man in the black cloak did nothing. The half-company stood on the ashes, and the soldiers repaired the palisade as if they were planning to live there for years. Tarion had banned all sorties, and the valley sat quietly, eating into its supplies. Meanwhile, Vaish worked just as Kyle himself would have. He wasn't looking for fugitives, he was looking for a pattern. On the 8th day, the sentries reported the first movement. The 50-man unit split into 5 groups of 10, and the groups took up positions on the 5 roads surrounding the ridge. Without hiding, out in the open, with campfires at night. Tarion looked at the map showing their positions, and his face darkened. He said this wasn't a cordon. There weren't enough men for a cordon. It was a trap set for live bait, and the bait had been chosen in advance. They were waiting for the valley itself to go after something it desperately needed. Kyle understood before the general had even finished speaking. Salt 111 moths to feed and dried meat for the winter, and not a pinch of salt left after the salt works, which they themselves had burned down, went up in flames. The nearest salt was stored in the ore warehouses by the ford, and all 4 roads leading to the ford were now guarded by dozens of Waish. The investigator assessed their situation from the ashes and remains and calculated their need like an accountant. Odan suggested biding their time. Mira said calmly and ominously that without salt, her first children would be born by midwinter. Zelda suggested the river. Dozens stand on the roads, but water isn't a road. Kyle listened to everyone and looked at the map through the eyes of war, and those eyes showed him what he did not want to see. The river at the crossing narrowed into a gorge, and while the Waish stood openly on the roads, in the river gorge they stood hidden. It was too obvious a hole in the net. That's how you leave a door through which people are herded. He said this out loud, and he said something else. You can walk through the door they're herding you into yourself if you know it's a door. They put the plan together in 2 days, and it was a 2-layered plan. The top layer was for Vaish's eyes. 6 of Zelda's boats would travel up the river at night toward the warehouses with obvious caution and a lookout like real thieves. The lower layer was for the actual operation. While the boats lured the ambush into the narrows of the Kale River, Tarion and his 5 men would take the warehouse from land via an old quarry tunnel that, according to the carver's recollection, ran under the hill 100 paces from the warehouse yard. Tarion approved the plan and added a 3rd layer to it. He said that the investigator must also have a plan to counter their plan, and that the entire reserve would be deployed this time. The night of the operation was shrouded in fog, a gift from the river and the Zelda. The boats entered the mouth with their oars wrapped in rags, and Vaish's ambush struck from both banks with nets and fire, just as Kale had calculated. Only in the boats, instead of people, sat dummies made of sacks of hay, and Zelda alone steered the boats, 2 at a time, thanks to the riverman's cunning. While the banks were burning hay, Kale was already standing in the warehouse yard, having emerged from underground with his 5 men. They took the salt quickly, and by weight, as Tarion had taught them. Not all of it, but as much as they could carry without overexerting themselves. And that's when Vaish's secret plan kicked in. The investigator had been waiting for the underground passage. He didn't know where it led, but he knew the fugitives had stone cutters from the quarry, so he had stationed a dozen of his best soldiers inside the warehouse in the darkness, hidden among the crates, lying in ambush for the ambushers. The courtyard gates slammed shut, and 10 blades emerged from the darkness all at once. Keela was saved by 2 heartbeats and the gifts of others. Her animal hearing picked up the breathing behind the crates before the steel flashed. In a single breath, the eye of war surveyed the cramped courtyard as a battlefield and revealed the only opening in the shut trap, a stack of barrels against the north wall that could be toppled and turned into a landslide. Kale shouted in the voice of a foreman whose orders were obeyed, and 5 men hit the ground before they even understood why. Blades swept over their backs. Then Kale struck the top barrel with his pickaxe, and the stack fell between his men and the soldiers like a cave-in in a mine shaft. What followed was a battle amid dust and salt, and in that battle, Kale fought against human beings for the first time. Vaish's soldiers were no beasts. The Empire maintained human units made up of freeborn servants, and these men fought for their rations and their place with a ferocity worse than that of beasts. Kyle struck at their limbs and bound them rather than killing them, and he lost time and blood because of this mercy. A blade slashed open his thigh. The second would have slit his throat had Tarion's reserves not entered the warehouse door, a force the general had led himself upon. Hearing the commotion, the old man fought with cold, measured precision, and the Waish soldiers recognized the military signal and scattered. They retreated underground, carrying away the salt and 3 wounded men. Kale was the last to descend into the tunnel, and at the edge of the courtyard, in the light of the burning hay, he saw a black cloak. Vaish stood on the warehouse wall, neither firing nor giving orders. He was watching. A fox-like beast with a narrow gray muzzle and calm eyes looked straight at Kale, and his gaze was that of a master who had encountered an unfamiliar task and wanted to understand the tool. Then the fox raised a paw and slowly pointed to his neck, to the spot where Kale bore the mark of the brand. He knew. Back at Mara's house, she sewed up Kayla's thigh and remained silent. her silence louder than any scream. They brought in enough salt to last the whole winter. They paid for it with 4 wounded and 1 captive whom they couldn't pull out of the dump. A young man from Priston named Tak was left lying stunned behind a stack and fell into Vaish's clutches alive. Tarvion said outright that the boy knew the way to the valley and that they had at most 3 days. The community gathered in a circle and the discussion was heavy. Half demanded they leave immediately and abandon the walls and the fields. Odan remained silent. Zelda said that leaving meant beginning to die slowly because winter would catch up to them faster than the Legion. Kaylee listened, looking not at the people but at the system's prompt that had been hanging before him all evening. The system was offering a new ability in exchange for accumulated sparks. It was called Echo of Will and did one simple thing. A liberated person could, with their consent, share their pain and strength with the bearer for 1 hour. Kale raised his hand, and the circle fell silent. He said there was no need to leave because the current wouldn't tell Vaishu anything. Not because he could withstand torture, but because Kale would take him away first. From Camp 50, from the very heart of the Imperial Order, Tarion looked at him as if he were mad, and then slowly, as if he'd found the answer he'd been searching for himself. The general said that calculated madness is called audacity, and that audacity is the only thing Vaish hadn't seen from them yet. The camp of 50 stood on the ashes of the sawmill, and Kale studied it for a full day without closing his eyes. The eye of war revealed the camp's layout to him like a cross-section of rock. The palisade had been rebuilt. 4 watchtowers. Guard shifts ran as regular as a pendulum because it was an investigator, not a lazy baron, who was in command here. Toku wasn't being held in a pit or a cage. He was being held in the central hut next to Vaish's own cabin. And that was the worst part of all. The fox didn't torture the boy. Lookouts on the hill saw Toka being brought food twice a day. Tarion explained it briefly. Vaish doesn't break his prisoners. Vaish buys him over. He gives him warm bread and conversation and waits for the boy to break under kindness just as he wouldn't break under iron. That takes a week. Not 3 days, which means there's still time, but every hour works in the fox's favor. A direct assault was out of the question. 50 men would have wiped out 70 militiamen in the open, even with their walls of audacity. A stealthy approach wouldn't work either. There were no tunnels beneath the ashes, and Vaish had positioned his camp dogs on the leeward side according to the rules of the trade. Kyle sat by the fire, sketching, erasing, and sketching again, and then he realized he was looking in the wrong direction. He was figuring out how to take the camp, but he should have been figuring out how Vaish would take the valley. The fox was expecting one of 2 things from them: flight or defense. He had roadblocks in place to intercept a retreat. For a defense, the Legion's advance was still months away. The only thing he hadn't anticipated was that the spoils would walk right into his camp through the gates. In the morning, a trade caravan of about 50 people arrived at the camp. 2 carts of salt and dried fish, under the flag of a free broker from the pier. Such caravans always went to the Imperial outposts because the quartermaster's office paid in silver. The caravan was led by an elderly cart driver carrying documents from the destroyed salt works that Zelda had taken from the burned-down office a month ago. The driver was Odan. The papers were genuine. The seals were genuine. The only thing that wasn't genuine was the salt in the 4 sacks on the second wagon where Kale lay, covered with a layer of salt 2 palms thick. He breathed through a leather tube leading out the bottom of the wagon and listened to the camp with animal-like hearing. The plan hinged on 3 key points. The first key point: the quartermaster of the 50-man unit liked Taitsk, and Odan got into a long argument with him over every sack, dragging out the unloading until the guard change. The second nail: Mara had set up the smoke. A pot with a smoldering mixture that Odin had accidentally left by the tethering post, in which an hour later gave off a steady, foul-smelling smoke that drove the lizard guards went berserk. The third nail was Kale himself and the hour of the Echo of Will. Before leaving the valley campfire, 40 of the freed ones took him by the hands in turn and gave their consent. The Echo of Will settled within him as a collective hum. For 1 hour he carried within himself Seld's endurance, Bran's hands, Tarion's calm, and Finn's stubbornness, and 36 more lives shared their strength with him across any distance. When the lizards went berserk and the camp swayed toward the horse tethers, Kale emerged from the sack through the torn bottom of the wagon and walked through the camp with the stride of a man who serves here. A stranger's memory of the paths guided him between the tents along the most obscure route that the Eye of War had calculated from the hill. He reached the central hut in 40 heartbeats. A single sentry stood at the door. The sentry would have died, but Kale struck him with a sleep dart from his healing gaze, and the beast fell as softly as a drunkard. Inside sat Talk, alive, unharmed, with a bowl of porridge in his hands. The boy saw Kale, and his face crumbled with shame, because for 3 evenings now, he'd been talking to the kind fox about life at the pier, and he understood where those conversations were leading. Kale didn't waste words on consolation. He said that you don't abandon your own twice, and with a blacksmith's instinct, he cut the shackles in 4 breaths. And then the door to the hut opened on its own. Vaish stood in the doorway. The fox was alone and unarmed, watching calmly like a man whose long-awaited guests had arrived. He said quietly that he'd bet on the 5th day, but the troublemaker had come on the 3rd, and that this was a pleasant surprise. Kale pushed Toka toward the window and stood between him and the fox. Vaish didn't budge. He spoke quickly and to the point, as they say, making offers that are hard to refuse. The Empire has known about the brand remover for 11 weeks now. The circular is just a smokescreen for the barons. In reality, there are beasts in the capital who stand to gain from having some of the slaves disappear from the records, and these beasts are willing to pay the troublemaker, well, with golden corridors as long as he took slaves from their enemies rather than from them. Vaish proposed an alliance with one of the court factions, freedom as a commodity. Kyle listened, and within the echo of his will, 40 lives hummed, and that hum spoke for him. He asked the fox if he remembered how the word no sounded in the language of Properta. Then he added that he would convey the Empire's proposal by other means, and he stepped out the window after Talk. The camp was already in an uproar, but the turmoil was directed elsewhere. At that very moment, 20 bonfires flared up in the night beyond the palisade on the southern side, and Tarion's horn blared the signal for a general assault, one that never came. 50 men, as required by regulations, took up defensive positions along the southern wall. Meanwhile, Kale and Talk rode out through the northern gate riding 2 frenzied lizards that Kale had subdued with the voice of a chieftain and calming spells. Odan had ridden out through the gate even earlier, amid a scandal, and with his silver still unpaid, and he cursed so convincingly that the guard remembered him as the most honest victim of that night. There was no pursuit until dawn. Vaish didn't send one. The sentries saw from the hill how the fox stood for a long time on the watchtower gazing north and then went back to his quarters, and the camp went to sleep. After hearing this, Tarion said that now everything would only get worse. The investigator had received the answer to the main question. He'd judged them to be bandits, but they turned out to be the Faith, and the Empire doesn't negotiate with the Faith with just a half-satya. 2 days later, Vaish's outposts were withdrawn from all the roads, and the half-satya marched south in formation toward the crossing. The valley breathed a sigh of relief, and Keel was the only one who wasn't rejoicing. The departure of a clever enemy isn't a victory, it's a report. Talk stood up in the general circle and told everything himself without making excuses, and his gift after his release proved to be bitter and precise. The young man had passed on to Kale a keen sense for detecting lies. Now Kale could hear insincerity in a stranger's voice as clearly as a crack in the rock, and a week later, the first stranger arrived in the valley. The patrol brought back from the pass an emaciated fugitive slave who had been walking north alone for 8 days, asking the same question everywhere: where to find the brand remover. Kale spoke with him by the campfire, and his instinct for detecting lies remained silent. The man was telling the truth. He had fled from the ore warehouses in Graven, where, after the salt night, the beasts had tripled their quotas, and where people were drawing an open ring with charcoal on the walls of the barracks. He said there were 20,000 branded people in Graven, and they were all waiting. And then he said something that made the campfire fall silent. The Empire is preparing as well. The vanguard of the Legion has entered Graven, 1,000 beasts. And it was not a general who led them, but the provincial governor himself. 1,000 beasts in Graven changed everything, and Tarion was the first to say so. Storming the city had become impossible. Waiting had also become impossible, because the vanguard is merely the Legion's finger, and the hand follows the finger. The general paced along the map for 3 evenings, and on the 3rd evening he stopped and spoke the word that Kaylee had been waiting for. From within. A city with 15,000 slaves cannot be taken from the outside, but it can rise up on its own if it finds a backbone. That backbone must be cultivated from within, behind the walls, right under the governor's nose. To do this, someone must enter Graven and live there. Kel said he would go himself, and the circle erupted. Zelda called it foolish. Odan was so silent you could hear it. Mira said that the mark on his neck was a death sentence at the first inspection. And then Kale revealed what he'd been keeping to himself. The system in exchange for 200 freed slaves, had unlocked a new ability called false script. The bearer could draw on their skin a semblance of a brand that appeared real to outsiders' eyes and to the recording stones, yet contained no thread. Kale demonstrated right by the campfire. He ran his palm across his neck, and a fifth-rank black pattern settled on his skin, just like the real thing. The circle fell silent. Tarion was the first to interpret this silence as a decision and began planning the infiltration as an operation. Keel entered Graven through the slave market, which was the safest route because those who were bought were not searched as thoroughly as those who were captured. Zelda, with the papers from the defunct salt works, sold him to a middleman as part of a batch of 3, along with 2 volunteers from the community, Hess, who had begged for this right, and the young woodcarver Yun. The middleman resold all 3 to Graven's ore warehouses, where, after the Salt Night, there was a shortage of labor. The circle closed with bitter precision. Kale became a number again. The city deafened him. For 40 years, it had been built like a machine for churning out people. The upper tiers of white stone, where the beasts lived. The middle tiers, where trade took place. And the lower city by the river, where 20,000 branded souls slept haphazardly in long barracks. Every morning, this mass flowed toward the warehouses, furnaces, and docks. And every evening it flowed back, and above it all, perched on the cliff, sat the governor's citadel. The governor's name was Argot, a bear man, 1.5 times the height of a human, who, 40 years ago, had personally accepted the surrender of the last cities, and had since regarded humans as a settled matter. The Legion's vanguard was stationed not against the slaves, but along the walls, because he feared not a rebellion, but that a rebellion would come from outside. Inside the city, he maintained the old guard and a network of informants. Kyle began by simply working for a month. He hauled ore alongside everyone else, and observed and listened with his 3 gifted senses all at once. The city revealed itself to him like rock. His instinct for detecting lies identified all the informants in the barracks within a month. Because an informant always lies, even when silent, his healing vision saw which of the people were on their last legs. The Eye of War mapped out the city, marking all the points where the beast's power held firm and where it was weakening. There were 3 such weak points: the grain warehouses at the southern gates, guarded by a corrupt river patrol; the Porters Guild,
where the human foreman had the right to roam the entire city; and the temple cellars of the old human faith, where the beasts had disdained to venture for 40 years. Keel began building his power base among the porters. The guild foreman's name was Marok, a stocky man of about 50 with a broken nose and the eyes of an old dog that had long since stopped caring. The beasts made him foreman precisely because of that indifference. Keel worked in his crew for a month, silently and diligently, and then, while unloading grain, he saw with his keen vision how Marok's heart was breaking.
The foreman sat down by the sacks, as gray as ash, and the guards were already on their way to finish him off because that was the way of things. Kale got there first. He placed his palm on Marok's chest in front of everyone as if simply to support him, and using the points of life, he steadied his heart and made it beat evenly. To the guards, it looked like he was just catching his breath. Marok realized that wasn't the case. That night, the sergeant found Kale
in the barracks and asked quietly who he was. Kale answered with a question. Did Marok remember a time when he hadn't been indifferent? The sergeant was silent for a long time. Then he said that he'd had 3 sons, and the city had devoured all 3 of them, one by one, and that, regardless, this was the only armor he had left. Kyle said he knew the armor better, and he revealed his neck, wiping away the false inscription. From that night on, the spine began to grow in sections, like a montage. Cut 1, Marok began placing people in the foreman's teams whom Kyle's instinct for lies had flagged. The quiet, reliable ones, the unbroken ones.
A month later, the Porters Guild was scouring the entire city through Kale's eyes and ears. Cut 1. The temple basements. Hess and Yun cleared a blocked passage from the lower city, and beneath Graven, a second secret life unfolded. Dry halls of the old faith where 100 people could gather at night. There, for the first time, Keel spoke before strangers, and the voice of the elder, to whom all were subordinate, carried his words through the barracks without a single piece of paper. Scene 3. The first liberations. One at a time, once a week, no more often. Kyle chose people who had no families held hostage and erased the brands in the basements, while false markings were applied to their necks from above. And to the city, they remained slaves. Those freed with false brands became his invisible 100. Gifts flowed in, the memory of the streets from an old water carrier, the hands of a lockpicker from a former thief, accounting skills and literacy from a warehouse clerk, the quiet step of a temple servant who had hidden among the slaves for 40 years. By the end of the third month, Keel had 90 freedmen and 400 initiates in Graven, along with a network that knew more about the city than the governor himself. And then the city sent an inspector to check on him. A new accountant from the Citadel arrived at the Porters Guild, a young she-wolf named Ursa, with cold eyes and better literacy than the clerks. Argat sent people like her to places where the accounts added up too perfectly, because perfection itself was also a clue. Ursa sat down in the guild office and began recounting everything for the past year. Marok remained composed, but Keela's instinct for detecting lies picked up something in the she-wolf's voice that no one had expected. Yrsa was lying to her superiors. Her reports to higher-ups showed balanced figures, but her own records, which a temple servant had quietly peeked at, revealed something entirely different. She was keeping track of the missing slaves throughout the province. 11 weeks. The very same 11 weeks Vaish had mentioned. The she-wolf wasn't working for the governor. She was working for the very same court faction that had offered Keela an alliance. And she wasn't looking for him to catch him. She was looking for him to buy him. In the fourth month, Ursa made her move. She summoned Keel to the office of one of the accountants under the pretext of a shortage, closed the door, and placed a blank sheet of paper on the table between them. Then she said calmly that a man with a fake fifth-class brand was hauling ore like a slave, but walking around like a master, and that real slaves don't make such mistakes. She said that her masters in the capital were ready to hand over the troublemaker Graven in his entirety. They'll have Argot removed by others' hands. They'll withdraw the Legion. They'll hand over the lower city along with all the brand marks. The price is simple. The troublemaker with his invisible army will continue doing the same work, but according to a list of cities that her masters will name. Freedom would remain freedom. It would simply have a master. Kale stared at the blank sheet of paper and listened with both senses at once. The lie in her voice was silent. The she-wolf was telling the truth. The offer was real, and that was the worst part. Kyle answered, neither yes nor no, and that in itself was an answer that bought him time. He told the she-wolf that an army that cannot be bought is worth more than one that can, and that he wanted to see Graven's price in writing from her masters. Ursa smiled for the first time in 4 months and said that the troublemaker was haggling like a capital city beast. The letter would be sent by carrier pigeon, and a reply would come in 20 days. Those 20 days became the fastest of his life. Kale gathered his inner circle in the basement, Maroka, Gessa, Yuna, and the 7 elders. He laid everything out for them, including the faction's proposal. He could have decided on his own, and they would have accepted it. He didn't want it that way. He said that freedom that comes with a master is called, in the old way, a brand. Just a golden one. Morok asked what would happen if they refused. Kale answered honestly. The faction would hand him over to the governor because an uncooperative troublemaker is more dangerous than one who's been caught. So the choice was simple: sell out, run away, or manage to rise up before the reply from the capital arrives. The silence in the cellar didn't last long. The old water carrier spoke for everyone. For 40 years, the city had been on its knees, and if it was possible to stand up, it was better to do so without asking permission. They were building the uprising the way Kyle built everything. Think first, then strike. Tarion had sent a plan from the valley via Zelda's trade network, a plan that he and Kale had pieced together over 2 months using fragments of letters. Kale's Eye of War refined it on the spot. Graven couldn't be taken by force, but it could be taken by a device. The city was a machine, and machines have switches. The grain warehouses, the bridges across the river, the gates, the Citadel's registry tower, where the stones bearing all 20,000 marks were kept, and water. The upper city drew water from the aqueduct, while the lower city drew from the river, and the aqueduct ran through the porter's quarters. They set the date for night, the 14th of the 20. New moon and the changing of the river guard. Roles were assigned according to gifts and people. The Maroka Guild took the bridges and gates from the inside without a fight, thanks to the corrupt guards who had been bribed with grain for half a year. Yun and the carvers shut off the aqueduct for a day so that the upper city would wake up with parched throats and think of water rather than the structure. Hess led 100 men with forged marks to the grain warehouses, and Kale took the registry tower because, as long as the stones remain intact, every slave in the city is on a leash, and the beasts can be executed according to the lists. This time, the echoes of will gathered for 10 days, 90 freed from Graven, and across the distance, 190 freed from the valley. Kale had never held so much within himself. Mara warned him in a letter that a mortal body has its limits and that she forbade him from doing more than 2 hours. 3 days before the deadline, the network stirred in the wrong place. At the general meeting of the elders, his instinct for detecting lies picked up a falseness in the voice of one of the 7. A young foreman of the grain cooperative named Darek was reporting on his men's readiness, and there was a crack in the word ready. Kale gave nothing away, but that night, the quiet footsteps and the hands of a burglar led him to Darek's cubbyhole. Under the floorboard lay the Citadel's silver in a note with a single word, when. The informant hadn't yet named the night because he didn't know it himself. Argot knew that a crisis was brewing in the city, but didn't know the timing. The Circle demanded that Derek be killed quietly. Kale decided otherwise, and that decision later saved everything. A dead informant is an alarm signal for the Citadel. A living informant is a channel of communication. They fed Darek a lie. The sergeant was, as it were, entrusted with the secret that the uprising was scheduled for the 20th night upon the arrival of the capital's response. Darek carried this news to the Citadel that very day, and Argot began preparing the city for the 20th night calmly and without haste. But the city rose on the 14th. The night began to unfold on its own. At the 3rd hour, the corrupt guards opened the river gates and the bridges fell at the feet of the guild without a single cry. At the 4th hour, the aqueduct fell silent and Yun emerged from its depths, completely white with lime dust. At the 5th hour, Hess took his post at the grain warehouses, and the distribution began right at the thresholds, for a well-fed city listens while a hungry one wreaks havoc. And at the 5th hour, Keel entered the accounting tower. The 3 of them took the tower, Keel with his 2-hour echo at 280 lives, and Hess and Yun working as a well-oiled machine. They neutralized the outer posts with sleep spells. The inner guard fought fiercely. They were the best in the city, and the echo of will carried Kyle through the blades as spring water carries ice. He moved with Bran's hands, Tarian's calm, and the quiet step of a servant, and he saw the battle with the eye of war 3 strikes ahead. At the Hall of Stones, they were met by the tower commander, an old leopard with a 2-handed blade, and the leopard was a master. The duel lasted 100 heartbeats and ended when Keel's healing gaze recognized the old warrior within the master. A shard lodged beneath his ribs from that very surrender 40 years ago. Kyle struck flat next to the shard, and the leopard fell alive because that night, Kyle had decided to kill only those who could not be subdued. The Hall of Stones opened like honeycombs. 20,000 accounting stones stood in rows, and each burned with a thread leading to someone's neck. Kyle placed his hands on the first row, and the system showed him what he'd been hoping for all 20 days, a mass deactivation. The price was all his accumulated will, every last echo, and his consciousness to boot. He managed to tell guests to hold the door. Then the world turned white. 20,000 of Graven's brands went out in a single breath. The threads snapped all at once, and the sound that rippled through the city was later described in various ways by the people. Some said it was like a bell, others like an exhalation. At that moment, the rings drawn in charcoal on the walls of the barracks crumbled away of their own accord, because the real rings around their necks were no longer closed. The entire city rose to its feet, not by plan, but by heart. People emerged from the barracks, touching their necks, and walked out into the streets, while the Legion's vanguard on the walls watched this and didn't know what to shoot at, because they would have had to shoot at everything. Argot raised the Citadel on alert 6 hours later than necessary, because he was waiting for the 20th night. By dawn, neither the lower city nor the middle city were inhabited by humans. The Citadel, with its cliff and 1,000 beasts on the walls, remained an imperial island in a sea of humanity.
Callie woke up around noon in the temple basement because Mira, who had arrived with Zelda's convoy a week earlier under a false identity, was holding his wrist and cursing under her breath. He stepped out onto the square in the lower city and recognized the square him before he even spoke. A silence felt so thick that the river could be heard. Kyle looked at the thousands of faces and saw pale marks on their necks instead of the black bindings. He told them 3 things: that freedom is not the end, but the beginning of the count, that the citadel still stands and the legion is still marching.
And that as of this morning, the city once again has the name it had before the war. The city was called Graven on imperial maps. People called it by its old name, Volnitsa. And that evening, from the southern wall, a Morok sentry intercepted a pigeon flying toward the citadel. The note contained 2 words and the seal of the capital's faction. Yrsa had disappeared from the city the day before the uprising, and the note was no longer addressed to her, but personally to the governor, Argat. Kayla read the 2 words and called for Tarjan, who had entered the city with a detachment, Lena through the open gates that very morning. The words were simple: wait for the Legion. The Legion was advancing from the south, 20 days' march away, while above Volnitsa loomed a cliff teeming with 1,000 beasts and the governor who awaited them. At the first council of the free city, Tarjan stated a simple truth: no one can hold 2 fronts. The citadel must be dealt with before the Legion arrives at any cost. Otherwise, on the day of the assault, it will strike the city from behind. The council gathered in the former town hall, and it was a new council. Kale, Tarion, Zelda, who had brought all the valley's boats up the river, Marok from the city, and Mira from the infirmaries, and Odon, who had arrived with the last supply convoy and sat silently by the wall, just as he had once sat in the barracks. Meanwhile, the city was learning to be a city. Kale observed this in glimpses between his war duties. Bread was distributed according to the scribes' lists, and the lines stood in order precisely because, for the first time, the line was their own. Former slaves cleared the rubble at the gates and worked harder than they had ever worked for their masters. In the temple cellars, Mira set up a field hospital for 100 top-chans. And along the walls, from morning till night, Tarion drilled the militia. Of the 20,000 free men, 4,000 took up arms, and the general formed regiments from them, led by sergeants from the people of the valley. The citadel remained silent for 4 days. On the 5th day, Argot made a move that Keel had not foreseen, and one that cost the city dearly. At dawn, catapults fired from the cliff, not at the walls, at the grain warehouses. The governor had ruled the people for 40 years and knew that it was not steel, but hunger that kills a city. Stones and pots of fire landed with precision, and by noon the southern warehouse had burned to the ground along with 1/3 of the city's grain. The calculation was cold. A starving Volnitsa was bound to open the gates to the Legion on its own in 20 days. The city reeled. A crowd gathered at the ruins, and for the first time since the uprising, the word that Kale had both waited for and feared rang out from within the crowd. Surrender! An elderly woman with scorched hands screamed that at least her children had something to eat under the rule of the beasts. His instinct for detecting lies remained silent. She wasn't lying. That was the worst part. Kyle walked out to the ruins unescorted and spoke to the crowd for an hour, promising nothing but the truth. He said there was enough grain left for 14 days at half rations, that the citadel wanted precisely this cry and precisely this surrender, and that the city had something it had never had before, the river and its own free will. Then, in full view of everyone, he gave the crowd his own council ration, and the council followed suit. The crowd dispersed quietly. The word surrender hadn't died, but it had sunk to the bottom. The citadel's response took 6 days to build, and 3 forces worked on it: the Zelda and the Rivermen, Rodan and Kyle. And Bran, who had arrived with the last supply convoy and, upon seeing the machines on the cliff, said just one word: "We'll get it." The citadel's cliff was considered impregnable on 3 sides, and it was. On the 4th side, the river washed against it, and there the wall stood directly atop the old masonry of a human-built structure. Odin had been studying that masonry from the boat for 3 nights in a row, pressing his palm against the stone, and on the 4th night he said that the masonry was worn, and that inside it ran an old aqueduct covered by a grate below the water level. Kiel's Eye of War pieced together the rest. An assault couldn't be launched through the water conduit, but 20 men could be led into the heart of the cliff to the vehicles and the gates from the inside. On the night of the 12th day after the uprising, the river carried rafts of hay toward the cliff. They burned with a smoky, senseless blaze, and the citadel regarded the fire as the folly of the besieged. Amid the smoke and water, Seld's boats moved forward with their oars turned inward. Kale led the 20 men himself, driven by the echo of his will for 2 hours, and with Mara's warning pounding in his temples. Underwater, Bran cut through the aqueduct's grate with a tool he had forged over 6 days, cutting for 11 minutes on a single breath of Seld's river sense. Inside the rock it was dark, and the poacher's night vision guided the 20 through dead-end passages that only the city's ancient blood remembered. They emerged at the 3rd hour at the dead of night. The vehicles were parked on the upper platform under the guard of the crews, and the crews lay quietly asleep. Bran didn't destroy the vehicles. He turned them around, and then the 20 did what it had come to do. It opened the small northern gate of the citadel from the inside, and 300 of Tarion's finest, who had been waiting beneath the wall since midnight, entered through the gate. The battle for the citadel raged until noon and was the city's fiercest struggle. 1,000 beasts fought like cornered beasts, and 140 men of the freehold fell in the inner courtyards. In this battle, Kiel lost his old water-bearer and 2 of Marok's senior officers. Argata was captured in the throne room, where the governor was fighting 10 men with a 2-handed axe and had felled 4 of them before Kiel entered with the Eye of War and ended the duel in 30 heartbeats without killing him. The Bearman was taken alive because Tarion had said beforehand that a dead governor is a banner of vengeance, but a living one is the key to negotiations. By evening, a banner with an open ring was raised above the citadel, and the city below screamed so loudly that the river trembled, and Kale stood on the upper platform by the deployed vehicles, looking south. From there, a legion was marching, 8 days' journey away. 5,000 veteran beasts, and to the same south, a 3-day journey from the Legion, the Eye of War was already marking on the map the only place where the city could take on this battle and not perish. A narrow pass where the old road entered the river valley, a place that Imperial maps called the Gates of Graven. The city spent those 8 days preparing for battle against the Legion as one long, grueling effort. Tarion said right away that Volnitsa wouldn't last even an hour in open field. 4,000 militiamen against 5,000 veterans. That's not a battle, it's a slaughter, so there would be no battle in the open field. There would be the gorge, and there would be work to be done. Graven's Gate was a narrow choke point, half the width of an arrow's flight, where the road was squeezed between the river and the sheer wall of the ridge. Kiel's eye for war and Tarion's 40 years of experience were laid out over this choke point in 2 layers of a single blueprint. The city worked on the construction, and Kiel remembered those days in cross-sections. Cross-section 1. Yun, with the carvers, and Odan, with the rock readers, gnawed into the ridge wall above the gorge and set wedges in 3 weak spots, just as they had once done at Wolf's Tooth, only 3 times larger. Cross-section 2. Bran, with the Citadel's forges, was forging spearheads and chains around the clock, and the machinery was being transported from the cliff on carts to the gorge, where it was dug into the ground at elevated points marked with targets. Snapshot 3. Zelda was preparing the river. 50 boats with rivermen and log barriers on chains that, at a signal, would block the water downstream of the gorge. Cut 4. Mira was setting up a field hospital in the league behind the gorge and teaching 100 women how to carry the wounded so that they would survive long enough to reach her, and Kale was burning off the brands. Every evening, there was a line at the Temple of Freedom, and he burned the black markings until his temples throbbed, because every freed person was a spark, and sparks were the echo of will, and the echo of will was his own weapon on the day of battle. The system's counter was creeping toward 3,000, and the gifts no longer fit within it as separate tools, but had fused into a single, seamless ability to live and see. On the 6th day, what Kale had been waiting for, and feared more than a legion, arrived. Yrsa. The she-wolf entered the city openly under the white banner of a negotiator and brought a letter bearing the capital's seal. The council read it in silence, The faction was making one final offer. The Legion could be stopped by an order that they already had ready. The price remained the same. Volnitsa would acknowledge her patrons and carry out the list. Attached to the letter was a second sheet, and the room grew cold at the sight of it. A list of hostages. The faction knew the names of the relatives of half the council who remained in other cities of the empire. They knew about Marok's sister in the capital, about Odan's grandchildren in the southern mines.
Since they couldn't buy them off, they would have to break them. Kyle looked at the counselors' faces and saw the letter taking effect. And then, in front of everyone, he asked Urza about one thing he'd realized back in Graven. If the faction had an order capable of stopping the Legion, then the Legion wasn't under the faction's command. Whose was it then? The she-wolf remained silent, and Kale's instinct for detecting lies read her silence like an open book. He spoke the answer himself. The Legion is led by their faction's enemy, the very same court that sent Vaish, and if the Legion is crushed at the gates of Graven, the faction will get what it wants, even without Volnitsa's consent, because the enemy's defeat is their victory. The letter was not an offer of help. The letter was an attempt to buy on the cheap what the faction had already hoped to obtain. For the first time in all their meetings, Ursa looked away. The council burned the list of hostages in the brazier, not because the names meant nothing, but because Tarion had spoken an old military truth: a hostage is alive as long as the one they're holding hasn't broken. The letter was returned to the she-wolf without a reply, and Kale told her, as they parted, that after the battle, the conversation would be different, and it would be the other side doing the talking. On the 7th day, the sentries reported the Legion's composition, and Tarion aged before our eyes in the span of a single report. 5,000 with the siege train, heavy rhino infantry in scale armor, archers from the Fox clans, and commanding the Legion was a beast whom the general knew from the southern pass. Commander Sharg, a tiger man who in 11 years was the only one to have managed to drive Tarion back from 2 defensive lines. Tarion said 3 words about him: he's in no hurry. And that was the most terrifying description of an enemy that Kale had ever heard. Sharg confirmed this within the very first hour of the 8th day. The Legion advanced to the gorge but did not enter it. The Tiger's scouts sniffed out the gorge from a distance, spotted the high ground, and halted. The Legion began setting up camp in the field before the gates, thoroughly as if they were staying for months. Sharg had no intention of walking into a prepared trap. He planned to position himself in front of it and wait until the city had consumed its 14 days' worth of grain. The clever enemy had once again chosen starvation. That evening of the 8th day, the council sat in silence over the map for a very long time. A siege in the open field meant that all the work on the gorge had been in vain, and time was working in the Tiger's favor. And then Kale said what the Eye of War had been showing him since midday, and what he'd been reluctant to say aloud. If the beast won't walk into the trap, then the trap must be made from the very place it has already entered. Sharg set up camp in the field by the river, and that river is the Seld, and that night is 2,000 liberated souls, whose echoes a single man can carry. Tarion raised his head and asked quietly whether Kale understood that he was proposing a night battle involving the entire city against a legion of veterans. Kale replied that he wasn't proposing a battle, he was proposing a flood. The flood had been prepared for 30 hours and rested on 3 pillars: the river, the night, and a single lie that Kale had concocted for the Tiger in advance. The lie reached Shargu first. On the evening of the 9th day, a man defected from the city to the Legion. Derek, an informant whom Kale had kept alive since Graven and fed, spoon-feeding him a mixture of truth and what was necessary. Derek sincerely believed what he was saying because half the city believed it. The free town was in a panic. A week's worth of grain, the council was at odds, and most importantly, the troublemaker and his guard were leaving the city that night, heading upriver to save themselves and start over somewhere else. The Tiger naturally distrusted the defector, but Darek's words were confirmed by what he saw. Sharga's patrols had seen with their own eyes how, at dusk, a caravan of boats carrying armed men and flying the Ring's banner had left the city and headed upriver. Sharga did what any commander would have done. He reinforced the night watches on the city's side and at the Narrows, where a desperate sortie would logically be expected, and redirected some of his attention upstream in pursuit of the troublemaker who had fled. Downstream, below his camp, the Tiger paid only half a mind to the area, because only water would flow that way, and water did come.
At the 4th hour of the darkest night, Zelda released upstream from the camp everything the city had gathered over 30 hours. Rafts of hay doused with oil from the citadel, bundles of firewood, and boats loaded with mare's pots containing that very smoke that drives the lizards mad. The fire was set 2 bends upstream from the camp, and the river carried it straight to the tigers all at once. The burning water spread along the entire riverfront of the camp, and the wind from the river carried the smoke toward the tents, smoke that caused the siege column of 300 lizards to break free from their tethering posts all at once. The Legion's camp did not panic because veterans do not panic. The camp began to extinguish the fire, fight the lizards, and reorganize in a proper and coordinated manner. And in that quarter hour of orderly action, it became something it had never been before, a crowd preoccupied with something other than war. During that quarter hour, the Volnitsa entered the camp from 3 sides, not 4,000, 1,200 of the best, in 3 wedges. Tyrion's wedge advanced from the pass through the camp gates that Yun's sappers had breached at ground level. Marok's wedge advanced from the river across the burning bank, clad in wet hides, and Keel's wedge drove straight into the very heart of the command tents. Keel carried within him an echo he had never carried before. 3,000 people liberated from the city and the valley had given him an hour, and he marched through the camp like that very flood, the eye of war guiding him among the hundreds with 3 thrusts forward, while points of sleep and points of pain flew from his hands faster than the blades had time to rise. He killed almost no one. He shattered the order. He toppled the banners of the hundreds. He silenced the buglers. He struck down the commanders of the tens with points of sleep. The Legion was blinded and silenced from within faster than it could muster itself. Sharg rallied it anyway. The tiger stepped out of the command tent into the fire and chaos and, within 200 heartbeats, formed a corps of 500 veterans around himself, who stood in a square and marched through their own burning camp toward the gorge, because Sharg instantly understood the plan and decided to trade the camp for a breakthrough into the city while the city was still there. It was a master's move, and it nearly succeeded. The square crossed half the field to the mouth of the gorge, swept away the barricade, and Tarion managed to deploy his wedge in pursuit only by a miracle of training. At the very mouth of the gorge, Sharg's square formation was met by high ground. Brand's machines struck their targeted marks, and Odan's wedges fell in 2 avalanches, not onto the square, but in front of it, sealing the gorge with a wall of stone. The tiger had run aground on a mountain that could not be cut down. It turned around in the middle of the field, surrounded by the ring of fire from its own camp, and it saw the dawn. The dawn revealed the field to it. The Legion had not been shattered in battle. The Legion had been dismantled like a machine from which the axle had been removed. A third had fallen or was burning along with the camp. A third had scattered across the steppe after the beasts, without formation or banners. Surrounding the tiger stood a corps of just over 1,000 exhausted beasts, without supply trains, without vehicles, and without water, because the fire had barred their way to the river, and the rocks had blocked their path to the gorge. And opposite them, across the field, stood Volnitsa, and above it rose the banner of the ring. Keel stepped forward alone, unarmed, and asked for a conversation. Sharg also stepped forward alone, for he was of the same breed as Tarion. They stood in the middle of the scorched field, and the tiger looked at the man for a long time. Then he said that for the first time in 40 years, he had seen slaves fight not with fury, but with wit, and asked what the troublemaker wanted. Kale replied that he wanted the 1,000 beasts to return home alive. The city would give them water and a path south. There is one price.
Sharg will carry to the capital the truth of what happened here, and the words that Kale is about to speak. The Empire could send 10 more legions and burn Volnitsa to the ground, but the brands are fading and will continue to fade in every city where the news reaches, and they will have to burn their own property with their own hands until there is nothing left.
Or the Empire could acknowledge that something has appeared on the map that hasn't been there for 40 years. People. Tiger was silent for a very long time. Then he said that he was a soldier, not a court official, and would relay everything exactly as he'd heard it. He added in a muffled voice that there was a prisoner left in his wagon train whom the troublemaker should know about. Investigator Weish was traveling with the Legion as an observer from the court, and that night, during the campfire, his tent was seized by his own men because they found in it secret correspondence with the enemies of the court that had sent him. The Fox had played his factional games to the hilt.
Shark said he had no use for this beast and handed Vaish over to the city, along with the wounded, whom Mera took in to treat, all without distinction of race. The Legion marched south on the third day. The Free People buried their 260 dead, and Keel stood over the long grave. For the first time in both his lives, he didn't know what to do with the silence inside him. And on the fifth day, the first foreign caravans began streaming toward the city from the north and east. News of the field at the gates of Graven spread across the empire faster than carrier pigeons, and on the very same night in 3 neighboring cities, slaves emerged into the squares with pale marks on their necks. Because a month earlier, Keel had secretly threaded his chains through them and erased their brands through trusted agents on Marok's lists. The empire did not by the sword, it was shaken by the count, and in the capital, they understood this before anyone else. At the end of the second week after the battle, a diplomatic mission under the Black Imperial Standard entered Volnitsa, not from a faction, from the throne.
And it was led by a beast at the sight of whom Tarion rose from his seat as slowly as he had before the old war. The Chancellor of the Empire, the right paw of the Emperor of Beasts. The Chancellor's name was Orvus, and he was of the Raven clan, which Tarion deemed a bad omen. The Ravens at the Beast's court had been keeping the accounts for 40 years and had never fought. If the throne had sent an accountant, it meant the throne had decided that the sword could no longer prevail here. The negotiations at City Hall lasted 9 days and were a battle fiercer than the night itself. Orvus began with a map. He laid out the empire before the council, and the empire was vast. 40 provinces, 200 cities. The Freelands, with its 3 unstable neighbors, lay on this map like a coin on a table. The Raven said, without a hint of threat, that the empire could lose this coin and not even notice. Simply seal off the province with checkpoints, strangle trade, and wait 10 years until the Freelands devour themselves. Kyle's instinct for detecting lies listened and heard something terrifying. The Raven hardly ever lied, hardly ever. The lie hung like a thin crack in one place in the word, wait. The Empire could not wait, and by the 3rd day, Kyle understood why, while Vaish confirmed it by the evening of the 3rd day. Kyle kept the fox in the citadel, not in a pit, but in a room with paper, and the fox quickly chose a side, just as foxes do. He explained the workings of the court. The emperor is old. The court is torn into factions. For 40 years, the treasury has relied on a slave registry, and that registry is sustained by the fear of the inevitability of the brand, not by guards, on the belief that the brand is permanent. 3 cities with faded brands had shattered that belief. Rumors had already spread throughout the empire, and slave prices had fallen by 1/3 in a month, which meant that the collateral underpinning half of the empire's debts was crumbling. The empire was burning, not because of a rebellion. It was burning because of the books. Voron did not come to crush them. Voron came to save the treasury and to negotiate. Armed with this knowledge, Keel returned to the table on the 4th day, and the conversation took a different turn. Orvus proposed the status of a free district. Volnitsa and the 3 cities would receive self-governance under the throne's authority, pay taxes, and hand over the instigators of unrest in other provinces. In response, Kale laid his proposal on the table, and the council approved every word in advance. First, the free union of cities would not be under the throne's direct control, but would be established by treaty as an equal partnership. Second, the right of exit for any person in the empire. A slave who reached the lands of the Union would be free, and the Empire would not pursue them. Third, no one would ever be extradited under any circumstances. Voron listened and counted, and Kale saw with the eye of war how the abacus beads moved behind those dark eyes. On the 6th day, Orvus presented his final argument, and the argument was cunning and precise. He said he was not speaking to the entire council, but to one man, the rebel system. The court knows more about it than the rebel realizes. In the archives of the throne lie records of a previous such system from 200 years ago in another country across the sea. That bearer also erased the brands and also collected gifts and ended up becoming lord over the liberated because a person who carries within himself thousands of foreign powers ceases to be a human among humans. The Raven personally offered Kale a title and a place at the not as a mockery. As the path the previous bearer had taken, the hall fell silent, and Kale felt his own counsel staring at him in the stillness. Not with suspicion, with a question that no one had asked aloud all these months. He stood up and answered the Raven in front of everyone, speaking not for the Raven's sake. He said that he knew this price better than the archives did. that every gift within him was not his own power, but the trust of others, given voluntarily, and that trust cannot be accumulated into power because it vanishes the moment one tries to appropriate it. And that his system had a property the archives did not know about. He had discovered it a month ago and had remained silent until now. The bearer can return the gift, not a copy, the original, for good. Then Kale turned to the council and did what he had been preparing since the night after the battle. He called Yuna forward and returned to him, in the palm of his hand, the carver's firm hand, doubled. He summoned the young sergeant from the militia and gave him the eye of war, right before Tarian's eyes. He gave the memory of the roads to the caravan foreman. He gave the voice to the village elder Marok. With every gift he returned, it grew quieter and lighter and more terrifying within him, and he did this in front of the raven on purpose. The empire was not to carry back to the capital a fairy tale about a new master of slaves. It was to carry back a report on what the beasts had never understood, a power that gives of itself. Orvis watched this for a long time, and for the first time in 9 days, his paws rested motionless on the table, lost in thought. Then the raven said quietly that he had now seen everything and that the treaty would be concluded. The treaty was signed at noon on the 9th day in the town square, with the entire city in attendance. A free alliance of 4 cities, the rite of passage. Open trade, no extraditions, no taxes, and no interference from the throne. The empire recognized on its map what it had refused to acknowledge for 40 years. People. Orvis signed on behalf of the throne and said some parting words to Kale that he remembered. The raven said that the empire had survived wars and the plague, but wasn't sure it would survive this precedent, and he left for the south. A day later, Ursa left as well. The she-wolf came to see Kyle before her departure, without a white rag and without any proposals, and said that her faction was recalling her because there was nothing left to trade. Then she paused at the door and added on her own. There are 300,000 branded people in the capital. Someday, someone would come there too, and she would like to live to see it. Kyle replied that the road north was now open to anyone, and that this applied to the wolf women as well. Ursa smiled for the second time since they'd met and left. The city celebrated the treaty for 3 days, and during those 3 days, Kyle barely slept because the system hovered before his eyes with a new line, and that line wasn't a task. For the first time, the system was asking a question. The 3,000 threshold has been crossed. The host has fulfilled the grain condition. The system is ready for the final action. Transmission. Kale stared at that word night after night, not understanding it and afraid to understand it. And on the 4th night, understanding came from a direction he hadn't expected. Finn woke him up. The boy had grown a head taller over the past year and stood in the doorway with a candle, his face the kind you wouldn't want to be woken by for no good reason. He said that an hour ago, a lone horseman had stopped at the southern outpost, alive but barely, and that this man had ordered them to wake the brand remover and relay the message, word for word. Across the sea, on the old continent, a second system had awakened, a dark one, and its bearer does not erase the brands, he imprints them. The messenger's name was Asher, and he was dying. Mira kept him alive for 6 days, and at the end of the 6th, she told Kyle that the man was burning up not from his wounds, but from what he was carrying. Kyle sat by his bedside for all 6 days and pieced the story together bit by bit. Across the sea, on the old continent, the empire of beasts did not prevail, because there, the people were betrayed by their own. 200 years ago, the local bearer of the light system accepted a title and a place at the throne, and the gifts of thousands of the liberated became his own power, and power became authority. And authority became a new chain. The light system died within him only to be reborn. Thus was the dark system born. Its current bearer was called the Lord of the Knot and imposed marks that required neither guards nor registration stones, for they were held in place by a will once freely given. Asher was one of the last free people from that shore. Their ship had sailed across the sea for 4 months, and of the 11 who set out, he was the only one to reach the other side. He did not bring a request for an army. He brought a question. Is it true that on this shore the system has remained the light one? And if so, let its bearer learn where the path ends if he walks it to the very end without letting go. On the 7th day, Asher died at dawn, and before his death he asked for freedom, even though he bore no mark. Kyle understood. He took the dying man's hand, and Asher said he wanted to be free, and the system accepted this as it would have accepted an erasure. The gift that passed to Kyle was the last on his list and the strangest of all, the memory of that shore. 200 years of another's history poured into him entirely, and he saw the path of the previous host from the inside year after year. He saw how a man who had started out exactly like him, step by step, rationally and with sound reasoning, had not given up a single gift, and what had become of it. Now, Kyle knew what the word transfer meant. The system wasn't offering him new power. The system was offering him a way out that the previous bearer had rejected. A bearer can pass on the system itself, not to one person, to the people. Dissolve it within every liberated soul so that the ability to erase brands and accept another's will ceases to belong to a single individual and becomes a trait of the free, like speech or memory. The price was written in a single line. The bearer loses everything he has accepted, all gifts, all the will he has gathered, everything. Kale carried this knowledge in silence for 2 weeks, and for those 2 weeks, the city lived its new life, and life was good. The Union was taking shape. Along the northern road, fugitives from the south were arriving at a rate of 100 people a week, and at the Alliance's border they were met with bread, and their brands were extinguished, now without Kale, because he had managed to teach the ritual of sparks to 12 of the first to be freed. Tarion was establishing military schools. Selda led the first trade caravan to the Imperial port under the terms of the treaty. Bran branded his blades with an open ring, and that ring was already a living symbol in its own right on the walls of 300 cities of the Empire, if the merchants were to be believed. Kale made his decision not in the council, but in an old mine. He traveled there alone across the mountain range through the first snow. Black cliffs stood abandoned because Baron Varg had been the first in the province to go bankrupt. Kale descended to the second horizon with a lamp, walked to the spot where his basket of 11 measures had once stood, and sat down on a rock. It was here, a year ago, that he decided the boy Finn would meet the quota even at the cost of his own life, and the system had chosen him for that decision. He asked himself honestly whether he was ready to make the same decision again, now that what was at stake was not just one life, but the combined strength of 3,000 lives. The answer came easily, and Kale laughed alone in the darkness of the tunnel. Strength had never been his. He had simply carried it carefully. The time had come to set the burden down. The handover was scheduled for spring, on the anniversary of the uprising, and they made it a celebration for the entire Union. 40,000 people gathered in Freedom Square, along with delegations from 3 cities and even an Imperial observer sent by the Chancellor. Kyle stepped onto the platform unescorted and spoke briefly. He told them everything. About the system. About that shore. About the Lord of the Knot, who might one day come across the sea. And about why the freedom held by a single person is simply a chain that hasn't yet been broken. Then he asked everyone who had been set free in the square to do what they had once done around the nighttime bonfires, to speak their consent aloud. 40,000 voices spoke, and Kale unclenched his hands. It wasn't like the white flash from the recording tower, it was quiet. Year after year, gift after gift, the system flowed out of him and dissolved into the square like heat in water. The blacksmith's intuition went to those standing by the forges. The healing vision settled upon Mira's healers.
The sense of deception, the memory of roads, river water, and night vision. Everything returned to the people to whom it had belonged from the beginning. The ability to extinguish was the last to depart, and Kale felt it divide into 40,000 parts. Within each now liberated part lived a spark that, with the circle's unanimous consent, could burn any black sigil. Freedom no longer had a vessel. It had found a people. Kale stood on the platform, empty and light as on that first morning in the mine, and listened to himself. Inside, there were no gifts. Inside was what was his own, the hands of a mine rescuer, stubbornness, and the memory of 2 lives. He looked out at the square and saw that the square was both weeping and laughing at once, and that Finn stood in the front row, already half a head taller than Odan. By evening, the Union Council presented him with a document granting him a lifetime position as leader, and Kella refused it in front of everyone and asked for something else. A teaching position at the first school in Volnitsa, where the children of former slaves were taught reading, arithmetic, and mountaineering. The council remained silent, but Tarion laughed out loud for the first time in the city's memory and said that now he had seen it all. Years later, stories of that day varied, and in some accounts, Kale would either fly up to the heavens or sail across the sea to defeat the Lord of the Knot.
The truth was simpler and better. He stayed. He taught the children to listen to the stone. He married the daughter of the harbor master, and Mera bore them 3 children, and never again was a brand burned onto any infant on that shore. When black ships did indeed arrive from that shore 10 years later, they were not met by a hero bearing 1,000 gifts. They were met by a union in which every free person carried a spark. And the Lord of the Knot learned what the Empire had once learned. A single person can be bought, broken, or killed, but a people for whom freedom has become second nature, that is impossible. The ships sailed away empty-handed, and that is an entirely different story, one that children in the schools of Volnitsa are taught after that first one. The story of slave number 617, who once decided that a stranger's boy would fulfill the quota. And with that decision, he fulfilled the quota for all of humanity. On the wall of that school hangs a pickaxe with a forged tip, and beneath it, carved into the stone, is an open ring and 3 words: freedom is not worn. Freedom is passed on. The Chancellor's name was Orvis, and he was of the Raven clan, which Atarian called a bad omen. For 40 years, the ravens at the court of the beasts had kept count and never fought. If the throne had sent an accountant, it meant the throne had decided that the sword could no longer prevail here. The embassy entered the city at 1 o'clock, and the city watched it in silence from the rooftops and walls. 40 guards on horseback, dressed in black. 3 covered wagons carrying scribes and chests of papers, and 1 old raven in a simple traveling cloak who stepped out of the wagon on his own without assistance, surveyed the square, and was the first to bow to the city. Tarion said quietly that this bow was worth more than all the threats, because the Empire bows only to that which it has recognized as a force. The negotiations took place in City Hall for 9 days, and were a battle fiercer than the night. Orvis began with a map. He laid out the empire before the council, and the empire was vast. 40 provinces, 200 cities, 12 million branded subjects. The free city, with its 3 unstable neighbors, lay on that map like a coin on a table. The Raven said, without a hint of threat, that the empire could lose that coin and not even notice. Simply seal off the province with checkpoints, strangle trade, and wait 10 years for the free people to devour one another. He spoke calmly and politely, and every word was weighed on scales that Keel could not see. The council listened and grew somber because there was truth in his words. The Union could not sustain itself without trade for more than 2 years. Kale's instinct for detecting lies was on high alert, and he sensed something terrible. The Raven hardly lied at all. Hardly. The lie hung like a thin crack in one place, in the word, wait. The Empire could not wait, and by the 3rd day, Kalo understood why, while Vaish confirmed it by the evening of the 3rd day. Kale kept the fox in the citadel, not in a pit, but in a room with paper and ink, and the fox quickly chose a side, just as foxes do. At first, he bargained for his life. Then he realized that no one valued his life, and he grew bored, and a bored investigator starts working just for the sake of working. Vaish described the inner workings of the court the way one describes a favorite pastime. The emperor is old and ill, and there are 3 heirs, each relying on his own faction. The court is torn apart. The treasury has been keeping a slave registry for 40 years, and this registry isn't guarded. 12 million brands would never be enough to mark all the slaves. The registry is maintained on the belief that a brand is permanent, on the inevitability of it. A slave doesn't run not because he fears pursuit, but because there's nowhere to run and no reason to. 3 cities with faded brands destroyed that belief in a single autumn. Rumors spread throughout the empire, and slave prices fell by 1/3 in a month, and slaves are the collateral for half the empire's debts. The beastly banking houses were already demanding repayment from the treasury. 2 more autumns like this, and the empire will start selling off provinces to pay its bills. The empire was not burning because of a rebellion. It was burning because of the books. Vaish finished speaking, looked at Kyle with a strange expression, and said that for the first time in his life, he was glad to be on the side that was winning without an army. Armed with this knowledge, Kyle returned to the table on the fourth day, and the conversation took a different turn. He didn't lay all his knowledge on the table. He simply stopped rushing. Voron proposed the status of a free district. Volnitsa and the 3 cities would receive self-governance under the throne's authority, pay tribute in grain and iron, and hand over the instigators of unrest from other provinces. In response, Kale laid his proposal on the table, and the council had approved every word in advance during the night council. First, the free union of cities would not be under the throne's direct control, but would be established by treaty as an equal partnership with the seals of both parties. Second, the right of exit. Any person of the Empire who reaches the lands of the Union is free from the moment they cross the border, and the Empire shall not pursue them or demand their return. Third, no one shall ever be extradited under any circumstances or for any price. Orvis listened and asked whether the council understood that the right of exit was a hole in the bottom of the imperial treasury through which everything would drain away. Kyle replied that he understood, and that this was precisely why it was in the Empire's interest to sign the agreement now, while the hole was the size of a province rather than half the Empire. For the first time in 4 days, Voron gave him a long look, and Kyle saw the abacus beads moving behind those black eyes. The 5th day was spent haggling over borders and trade duties, and it was here that Selda unexpectedly shone. She bargained with the imperial scribes for control of the river routes so skillfully that even Orvus smirked and said he'd hire this woman for the treasury. Selda replied that the treasury should come to her on its own terms, through the right of exit. The hall laughed for the first time in 5 days, and the laughter, too, was part of the battle. On the 6th day, Orvis laid out his final argument, and it was both underhanded and precise. He asked to speak with one person. The council stepped out, leaving just the 2 of them, and the Raven began to speak of another, the Rebels system. The court knows more about her than the troublemaker realizes. In the throne's archives lie 200-year-old records of another such system in a country across the sea. That bearer also erased the brands and collected offerings, and ended up becoming the master of the liberated, because a person who carries within themselves thousands of foreign powers ceases to be a human among humans. At first, everyone needed him. Then, he became stronger than anyone else. Then, he began to fear that his power would be taken away. And the fear of the powerful is tyranny in the making. Voron spoke quietly and without malice, and that was worse than malice. He personally offered Keel the title of Prince of the Borderlands and a place at court, not as a mockery, as a way out, one that the previous bearer had accepted. The Empire knows how to live with powerful loners. It does not know how to live with ideas. Then Orvis added one last thing. He said that he had been watching Kyle for 6 days and saw a man who was weary, just as those who bear the burden of others grow weary, and that the Empire was offering him the one thing his own people could not offer, the right to lay down the burden and remain simply a beast. He hesitated and corrected himself, simply a human. Keel was silent for a long time. The Raven waited patiently. Then Keel asked for the advice back and replied in front of everyone, speaking not just to the Raven. He said that he knew this price better than the archives because he carried it every day, that every gift within him is not his own strength, but the trust of others, given voluntarily, and that trust cannot be accumulated into power. It vanishes the moment someone tries to appropriate it, and that his system has a property unknown to the archives on that shore because that carrier had not yet reached him. The carrier can give the gift back, not a copy, his own for good. Well, the hall fell silent. Not even the council knew about this. Kale discovered this property a month ago, one night after a battle, as he sat poring over the list of the fallen, and the system silently showed him a line he had never read to anyone. Then he turned to his people and did what he had been preparing to do since that very night. He called Yun forward, took him by the hands, and restored to him the firm hand of a carver, and Yun gasped because the hand returned doubled against his own. He summoned a young militia sergeant named Callan, who on the night of the Legion had prevented the collapse of the left flank, and gave him the eye of war in front of Tarion. And Tarion nodded as one nods to a just command. He gave the memory of the roads to the caravan foreman. He gave the voice to the village elder Marak, and Marak wept openly. With every gift returned, it grew quieter, lighter, and more terrifying in Keel. He did this in front of the Raven on purpose. The Empire was not to carry back to the capital a fairy tale about a new master of slaves who could be bought with a title. It was to carry back a report on what the beasts had never understood. about a power that gives of itself and yet is not diminished by it. Orvis watched this for a very long time, and for the first time in 6 days, his paws rested motionless on the table, lost in thought. Then the raven said quietly that in 40 years of service, he had seen all kinds of power, except this one, and that there would be a treaty. For 2 more days, the scribes on both sides fine-tuned the wording, and Vaish unexpectedly proved useful because he knew imperial law better than the imperial scribes and caught them twice in the traps they'd set in the text. The treaty was signed on the 9th day at noon in the square, in full view of the entire city. A free alliance of 4 cities, the right of exit, open trade, mutual embassies, no extraditions, no taxes, and no interference from the throne. The empire recognized on its map what it had refused to acknowledge for 40 years: people. Orvis signed on behalf of the throne, affixed the black seal, and said some parting words to Keel that he would remember for the rest of his life. The raven said that the empire had weathered wars, famine, and the plague, but he, an old accountant, wasn't sure it would survive an example yet. Because a war can be lost and forgotten, but an example lives on in people's minds and cannot be suppressed, and he rode off to the south without looking back. A day later, Ursa left as well. The she-wolf came to see Kyle before her departure, without a white handkerchief or any proposals, and stood there silently for a long time. Then she said that the faction was recalling her because there was nothing left to trade. Her masters had lost, not to Kayla, but to their own court. She lingered at the door and added, on her own initiative, "There are 300,000 branded people in the capital, and half the accountants there are like her. They count what belongs to others and hate the count. Someday someone will come there too, and she'd like to live to see that day." Kyle replied that the road north was now open to anyone under the treaty, and that the word anyone included she-wolves as well.
Ursa smiled for the second time since they'd met and said she'd think about it, then left. For some reason, Kyle knew that in a year's time, he'd see her at the Union's border with a caravan of fugitives she'd lead out herself. The city celebrated the treaty for 3 days.
As for Kale, he barely slept during those 3 days. The system hovered before his eyes with a new line, and the line wasn't a task. For the first time ever, the system was asking a question. The 3,000 threshold has been crossed. The host has fulfilled the grain condition. The system is ready for the final action. Transmission. Kale stared at that word night after night, not understanding it and afraid to understand it. The word loomed before his eyes even in his dreams. And on the 4th night, understanding came from a direction he hadn't expected. Finn woke him up. The boy had grown a head taller over the past year and stood in the doorway with a candle, his face the kind you wouldn't want to be woken by for no good reason. He said that an hour ago, a lone horseman had stopped at the southern watchpost, alive but barely. The horse had collapsed beneath him right at the gates, and that this man had ordered them to wake the brand remover and relay his message word for word because he didn't have the strength to walk there himself. The messenger's name was Asher, and he was dying. Mira kept him alive for 6 days, doing so with all the ferocity of her craft, and at the end of the 6th day, she told Kyle that the man was burning up not from his wounds but from the burden he carried. The body could be patched up, but the burden could not. Kyle sat by his bedside for all 6 days, taking breaks only for brief sleep, and pieced together the story bit by bit amid the fever and delirium. Across the sea, on the old continent, the empire of beasts had not defeated humanity because there, humanity had been betrayed by their own. 200 years ago, the local bearer of the light system had traveled the same path as Kyle. The mines, fugitives, secret settlements, the first free city. Asher told this story, and Kale listened to his own life retold in a stranger's voice. And he felt cold, and then their paths diverged. That bearer won his great battle, sat down at the negotiating table, and accepted a title and a seat at the throne. The arguments were reasonable. That way, he could protect his own. That way, freedom was guaranteed. That way, it was safer. He did not give up a single gift because every gift was needed to defend the cause. At first, he was the shield of the free, then their judge, then their lord. The gifts of thousands of freed people became his own strength, and strength became power, and power became a new chain. And this chain was stronger than the imperial one because it was worn voluntarily. The light system died within him, not from betrayal. It died from frugality. It was reborn. Thus, the dark system was born. Its current bearer in the fourth generation, was called the Lord of the Knot, and imposed marks that required neither guards, nor registration stones, nor overseers. They were sustained by the free will that people had once given up of their own accord and had forgotten how to reclaim. Asher was one of the last free men of that shore. A handful in the northern fjords. Their ship had sailed across the sea for 4 months, and of the 11 people on board, he was the only one to make it. He was not carrying a request for troops, because troops could no longer help there. He carried a question. Was it true that on this shore the system had remained pure? And if it were true, then let its bearer learn where the path ends if one walks it to the very end without letting go.
On the 7th day, Asher died at dawn, and before his death, he asked for freedom, even though he bore no mark. Kyle understood what he meant. He took the dying man's hand, and Asher said he wanted to be free, and the system accepted this as it would have accepted an erasure, because freedom is not merely the absence of a collar around one's neck. The gift that passed to Kyle was the last on his list and the heaviest of all, the memory of that shore.
200 years of another's history had been poured into him year after year, and he had lived through the path of the previous bearer from the inside. Every rational decision,
Every kind argument for keeping the power for himself just a little longer. Every step by which the savior became a ruler. By the evening of the 7th day, Kale emerged from that memory with gray hair at his temples, and now he knew what the word transfer meant. The system did not offer him new power. The system offered a way out that the previous bearer had rejected 1,000 times for the very best of reasons. The bearer can pass on the system itself, not to a successor, not to the chosen one, to the people, to dissolve it among all those liberated at once so that the ability to erase brands and accept the will would cease to belong to any one person and would become a trait of the free, like speech or memory or fire. The price was written in a single line, without explanation. The host loses everything he has received, all gifts, all the will he has gathered, everything. Kale carried this knowledge in silence for 2 weeks and told no one, not even Tarion. For those 2 weeks, the city lived its new life, and life was good, which only made the decision harder. The alliance was taking shape. Along the northern road, fugitives from the south were arriving at a rate of about 100 a week, and at the border they were met with Brid, and their brand marks were erased now without Kale because he had managed to teach the ritual of sparks to 12 of the first freed people, and the ritual worked as long as the circle gathered their will together. Tarion established military schools and grumbled that there were more students than teachers. Seldus led the first trade caravan to the imperial port and returned with salt, iron, and 3 families of dockworkers who had simply boarded her boats.
Branded blades with an open ring, and the ring was already alive in its own right on the walls of 300 cities across the empire. If the merchants were to be believed, Mayura opened a school for healers. Finn commanded the southern patrol and did so in such a way that Tarion remained silent, and the general's silence was the highest praise. Everything was working.
And everything still rested on one man, and Kale saw this more clearly than anyone. They came to him for every major decision. His word carried more weight than that of the council. Mothers brought their children to him at the border. The first links of that very chain were already resting on his shoulders, as light as an honor. He made his decision not in the council, but in an old mine. He rode there alone across the mountain range through the first snow, telling no one except his wife Maroka, for whom he left a letter in case he did not return by the deadline. Black Cliffs stood abandoned. Baron Varg was the first in the province to go bankrupt when the slaves left, and there was nothing left to pay the free workers. The gates hung by a single hinge. Kale descended to the second horizon with a lamp, following the familiar tunnels, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness as if in a temple. He walked to the spot where, a year ago, his basket had stood, filled with 11 measures of ore, and sat down on that very same rock. It was here that he had once decided that the boy, Finn, would meet the quota, even if Kale himself were to end up in the pit for it. The decision had been foolish, selfless, and spontaneous, and the system had chosen him precisely for that reason. He asked himself honestly whether he would be capable of making the same decision again.
Now, when what was at stake was not just one life but the accumulated power of 3,000 lives, when there were 1,000 rational reasons to wait, the dark system across the sea, a fragile alliance, an empire that might change its mind. All the arguments of the previous host stood before him in formation, and everyone was valid. Kale sat in the darkness for a long time. Then he remembered Asher's face before his death and realized a simple truth that made him laugh alone in the empty tunnel, and his laughter rolled across the horizon. The power had never been his. He had simply carried it carefully, like someone else's tool, and a tool that one is afraid to let go of ceases to be a tool and becomes the master. The time had come to set the burden down, not because it was heavy, but because it wasn't his. The handover was scheduled for spring, on the anniversary of the uprising, and the council had debated it for 8 nights. Tarian was against it and spoke like a soldier. To hand over the only absolute weapon on the eve of a possible war with that shore was madness. Kale responded by reminding him of Asher. An absolute weapon in the hands of a single party is precisely what the other side is fighting against. The general thought it over for 3 days, and on the 4th, he said that in his life he had admitted to being wrong twice, both times to that boy, and that it was apparently time for a third. Mira asked only one thing: would the body survive? Kyle honestly said he didn't know. She silently organized the infirmary near the platform. The day of the handover was made a holiday for the entire Union. 40,000 people gathered in Freedom Square and the surrounding streets. Delegations from 3 cities stood there. Fugitives who had arrived over the past month stood there with the marks on their necks still fresh. The Imperial Observer, sent by the Chancellor, stood there, and a scribe beside him prepared the ink. Kale stepped onto the platform unescorted, wearing a simple shirt, and spoke briefly. He told them everything about the system and its grain quota, about that shore and the chain forged from surrendered will, about the Lord of the Knot, who might one day come across the sea, and about why the freedom held by a single person is merely a chain that hasn't yet snapped. Then he asked each freed person to do what they had once done around the nighttime bonfires, to say, "I agree," out loud. A wave swept across the square, and 40,000 voices spoke the word freedom, and Kale unclenched his hands. It wasn't like the white flash from the recording tower. It was as quiet as melting. The system flowed out of him, gift after gift, and dissolved into the square like heat in water. The blacksmith's intuition flowed to the people by the forges, and Bran, standing in the square, suddenly straightened up and looked at his palms. A healing gaze fell upon Mara, the healer. The sense of deception spread among the judges and elders. The memory of roads, river water, night eyes, and quiet footsteps, it all returned to the people whose nature had always been this way, only now it was forever and in many. The very ability to extinguish was the last to fade. Kale felt it split into 40,000 parts, and in each one that was set free, a spark ignited. A single spark could do nothing. A circle of 10 could extinguish the brand. The city could extinguish the prison. Freedom no longer had a bearer. It now had a people. Kyle remained standing even as the square swayed. Inside, he felt empty and quiet, and in that silence, he heard himself for the first time in a year. The hands of a mountain rescuer, stubbornness, the memory of 2 lives, all his own, nothing foreign. He looked down and saw that the square was both weeping and laughing at the same time, and that Finn was standing in the front row, already half a head taller than Odin, holding the old man by the shoulder. By evening, the council had brought him a document, granting him a lifetime position as head of the Union. Kyle refused in front of everyone and asked for something else. A teaching position at the first school of freedom, where the children of former slaves were taught reading, arithmetic, and mining.
The council fell silent, at a loss, while Tarion laughed out loud for the first time in the city's memory and said that now he had truly seen it all.
Years later, stories of that day varied, and in fairy tales, Kale would either ascend to the heavens or sail across the sea to defeat the Lord of the Knot single-handedly. The truth was simpler and better than fairy tales. He stayed. He taught the children to listen to the stone and read the weariness of the rock. He married the daughter of the harbor master, a quiet woman with a quick laugh, and Mara bore them 3 children, and never again did the brand burn on any child of that shore. Odin lived to be 90 and came to the school to listen to the walls until his very last day. Vaishar remained in the Union, established its secret service, and hunted down slave traders at the borders with an artist's delight. Ursa returned a year later, just as Keel had expected, and brought 200 people from the south. And when, 10 years later, the black ships of the Lord of the Knot did indeed arrive from that shore, they were not met by a hero with 1,000 gifts, one who could be killed, bought, or reborn. They were met by the Union, where the spark of freedom lived in everyone and where the brands faded faster than they were applied, because for every will that was surrendered, there was a circle that helped take it back. The Lord of the Knot stood off the shore for a month and learned what the Empire already knew. A single person can be broken, but a people for whom freedom has become second nature cannot. The ships sailed away empty-handed, and that is another story, one told in the schools of Volnitsa after the first. It's the story of slave number 617, who one day in a dark mine shaft decided that a stranger's boy would meet the quota at any cost, and with that decision, he met the quota for all of humanity. On the wall of that first school hangs an old pickaxe with a forged tip, the work of Bran, and beneath it, carved into the stone, is an open ring and 3 words. Freedom isn't worn, freedom is passed on. The students trace these words with their fingers as they head off to their first shift in the free mines, where the rock obeys those who know how to listen to it. And in those mountains, there's no one else you need to listen to.